Ion, welcome to the show. How you doing, brother?
Hey, Matt, doing well, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for creating some space and making some time. I've really been looking forward to this show.
Ditto. Yeah, we've
Yeah,
we've had it on the books for a couple of months now.
yeah, it's been a while. I was kind of booked out pretty far when we talked because I was just getting back into the second season, and I kind of just like hit up everybody that I really wanted to record with. And I only do one a week. Some people do two a week, and Joe Rogan does like 10 a week. So it's like. It's a bit much. I find one a week gives me enough time to research and still do all the other things that I'm trying to do.
Yeah, he probably has to have like an IV drip of adrenaline to be able to keep up the pace he keeps up. It's damn near superhuman.
There's got to be like a team behind him that's doing research for him too and giving him notes. And because I mean, he's just doing the UFC and he's all over the place. There's got to be like at least a small team who's giving him some notes and talking points. I would have to imagine.
I would think either that or a doppelganger. One,
Yeah, something. He's pumping him
I,
out. Yeah, and he does a good
this
job.
evil man, Rojogan. Yeah, it's the only way he can keep up.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. He must be really taking care of himself. I commend him, and it seems like he is. He's in good shape for being his age, and has the sauna and the cold plunge, and it seems like he's taking the right supplements and doing all the things. So I can't do nothing but try to be a little bit like him, I guess.
Yeah, actually, well, I mean, the way he approaches it is pretty admirable. I mean, especially, he's got the Morosco Forge and he's doing the saunas, and it's for those of us who have done all of that stuff, it's not for the faint of heart. That is for damn
Mm-mm.
sure. So it's but it does, on the upside, it does keep you going. I mean, the proof's in the pudding. I mean, when you and I talked, I think I was just kind of recovering from the motorcycle wreck that I was just in, but a lot
Yeah,
of a lot of that was just applied biohacking, right? I bashed myself up substantially and then recovered from it super 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 fast, but it was all the hacks that we all know.
absolutely. Yeah. Why don't we, before we dive into some of my questions, why don't you tell people about that accident, what you did to kind of heal yourself up real quick?
Note to self: don't hit a patch of gravel going 65 miles an hour so into a curve. Yeah, it's kind of like you suddenly are in a frictionless environment with no control over the vehicle. And on a motorcycle on the open road, it's a bad scene. So yeah, I face planted doing 65 on a motorcycle, and then as I was rolling the bike over on top of myself, my leg, my femur, the upper leg bone, the femoral condyle, which is the curve on the bottom of your femur, punched through the top of the tibial condyle and went down an inch, and then split my tibia straight down 6 inches. So the bone ended up
Wow.
wedged inside of the other bone, and then my collarbone was split in half. And then I kind of skidded to a stop, and with the bike tumbling on top of me, and bashed it up pretty well. And luckily, I never lost consciousness, didn't get concussed. Apparently, I have a reasonably strong head, thank God. But yeah, when I was laying face up, I kind of went through a quick systems check and rocked my head back and forth and thought, okay, no broken neck, solid, that's good. And then I started going limb by limb to see if I could move, and I couldn't move my right arm because it was just flopping because of the collarbone, which felt very awkward. And then when I got to my left leg, I tried to move it and immediately screamed because it went down and then kicked off at a very peculiar angle because the bone was inside the other bone. And so luckily this kid came by a couple minutes later and stopped and said, "Do you need help, mister?" And I said, Yes, I do." It wasn't one of those things I was just going to pick myself up and dust off and hop back on the bike. So I got carted via the most bumpy ambulance ride ever, 30 minutes to a hospital, and went in, and they loaded me up and brought me into a CT scanner to check out my leg. And unfortunately, this was actually probably the worst bit about the whole thing. The two orderlies, because I'm kind of a heavy guy, and the two orderlies, when they were pulling me off of the gurney, they hooked my foot on the side of the CT scanner, and my leg was kinked, and it went and popped the femur out of the tibia, which,
Oh,
yeah, actually, that's the kind of thing that I talked to one of the fellows that works for me who was a jump master. He was a spec ops guy. And he said that it's a high impact kinetic trauma. And it's the same sort of injury that a lot of guys get if their chutes don't deploy. And, the bone ends up inside the bone. And he said, yeah, you're really lucky because very often that vagal nerve shock, when you pop the bone back out, will trigger your body to just turn off. And a lot of people keel from that. So I thought, well, yeah, I guess I was lucky, but it was quite literally the most shocking physical sensation I'd ever had when the bone popped out of the other bone.
Yeah,
So
I'd imagine. My leg hurts just thinking about it.
yeah, it woke me up a bit. But then, the one upside was they did dislodge the bone out of the other bone, so I kind of owe them for that. And then, they brought me back in. The orthopedic surgeon came back in when they had the scans and told me, flat out, he said, "Look, this is a really, really bad break. We're going to have to put you under, open your leg up, put you back together with plates and pins and screws." And he said, "There's a lot of metal going in. You're probably going to want to come back at some point after you're rehabbed and have us open you up again and take out some of it, because aesthetically you'll be able to see, like the bulges on your legs from the plates and the screws." And I said, "Really? That's the best we've got?" And he was, "That's what you've got to do. It's a bad break." And I said, "Yeah, I don't think I'm going to do that." So I called my staff and said, "Hey guys, go buy a hospital bed, set it up at the lab." So they went out and they got a hospital bed, which is in the closet across from me now, and set it up at the lab. And then I had them go out to the lab and they picked me up in a Toyota Sequoia, kind of like a wounded dolphin. They pulled me off on a sheet and put me in the back because I couldn't really move, and drove me to my lab and set me up at the lab. And I did everything. I did V-cell injections, which are the very small embryonic like stem cells. I did 7 of those over 6 weeks, I think. And then I did pulsed electromagnetic field therapies with one of the big, heavy pulse center coils. I used actually the veterinary version of the pulse center coil for equines, because I figured it was like a horse with a broken leg. And
Right.
I literally would do cycles. I would do like between 40 minutes to an hour on my leg, and then I would shift it and do it on my collarbone, and then shift back and do it on my leg. And then I would intermittently do red light therapy. And I had my team build a kind of like a crane, basically, with these heavy duty red light bays from the EMR tech, and they would push them over me and flip them on. And I would just, put the goggles on and just kind of bathe myself and upregulate the mitochondria. And then I literally just did that for days, and I was drinking hyperoxygenated water, since I obviously couldn't really get in a hyperbaric chamber, which would have been great if I could, but couldn't really do that. And my hyperbaric chamber is not set up for that anywhere. It's very large, very hefty steel hyperbaric chamber, but it's set up to be seated, so I can spend 90 minutes a day in it, not something brief. So that wasn't an option. So I just did hyperoxygenated water. And then I used my Lila block and pretty much every modality that I thought would be beneficial, and I was sucking down my Wizard Science serums all the time, so I could keep the system upregulated, taking extra NMN and, GW 501, 516, and all kinds of, different things that I thought would add energy to my system and speed the recovery, and doing cold lasers on the brakes as well. So literally pretty much everything. But the upshot was, in a week, my bone had actually mended on my collarbone, moved back into position and refused, and that was great. And then my leg was completely mended and done in 9 weeks. So rather than the prognosis of it's going to be 12 weeks before you can put any pressure whatsoever on your leg, I was back up with the bone fully mended, walking in 9 weeks. And the only thing that was kind of an oddity, I think, to the orthopedic surgeon was how things sort of interestingly moved back into their exact position, which was very lucky for me. So that was good.
That was going to be my questions. Unreal. I would think maybe you could skip the pins and the screws, but you would still need some form of casting or something to kind of set it back in place. But it seems like all the biohacks, the body just knew what to do.
Well, I'm kind of a firm believer that the body really does know what to do. I'm also a big believer that the intrinsic kind of intelligence that dictates where the body goes and how it forms is not really totally endogenous. It's not all on the system. I'm kind of a big believer in the idea that a lot of the information is sort of stored on the cloud, if you will. It's one of those things that we've finally figured it out, and I generally think nature is many steps ahead of where we are. So if we realize, like, hey, you don't put every bit of information on the cloud, you keep a nice backup or rather put it on the box, you keep a nice backup copy on the cloud. My guess is nature is doing the same thing. So part of that was, really focusing on the pulsed electromagnetic field, so I could amp up the signal strength, if you will, which was kind of my thought was, if I boost the signal strength on the outside, I think it will translate over into the instructions on how to work on the inside. And actually, I talked to a lot of people. Our mutual friend Todd Shipman, Todd's daughter Hannah had snapped her arm, and it was a bad break, kind of the 90-degree bend on her, radius and ulna, and it recovered in 5 days. It was fully mended and fused, and it was all from pulsed electromagnetic fields. And then my friend Katie Wells, Wellness Mama, one of her kids did the same thing, and it was a 9-day healing cycle. So, and those are, one was a bad break, one was a really bad fracture. And then, I mean, I'm, proof's in the pudding for me. I've seen it firsthand because the rapidity with which all of my bones mended was ridiculous. Like I knew I had read studies about it and I had heard about it, but I didn't realize just how efficacious it was. It just absolutely kicked ass. Everything came back together really quickly. Took the inflammatory response down a bit. The pain wasn't as much. I would imagine. I mean, it's kind of hard to say that. I'm guessing based on what I've heard from people that I probably fared better. And I'm sure, I know that, the red light definitely mitigates a lot of the pain. So I think I probably fared a lot better on that front. So.
That's amazing. It's funny how it's everyone in this quote unquote like biohacking space or kind of alternative health space seems like quackery because we recommend so many random different kind of modalities when, I mean, even when people are just sick, like I tell them, well, hey, come over, do some ozone, take some methylene blue, things like that. And they're like, they're looking for some form of drug or something. I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. I tell you, I got stuff at my house if you want to come over and check it out. But it's so far out of their realm, and they end up going and getting antibiotics or whatever. And I'm always like, well, you'll see on the back end how that's going to affect your biology though.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I had gone the normal course of events, I wouldn't be walking well right now, I'm sure, and I damn sure wouldn't have been walking in 9 weeks. I would have still been recovering from hardcore surgery, and I just think we can do better collectively. I mean, and the sad part for me is, Western medicine, we do some things really, really well, but some things are very poorly done, and I don't think that people are really thinking through, because the technology's out there, but it's generally, there's a lag time between when people do the research and when you actually see it kind of hit the mainstream. And oftentimes, doctors, because they're constantly working and trying to help people, they don't have time to go back and look at what the latest research is and, the latest techniques, right? Like their CEUs, the continuing education credits, like they're not being kind of forced to learn the latest and newest things. And most of the guys I know that are doctors, their heart's in the right spot. They really want to help people and, make a difference, but they're all slammed. Just the system in which they have to survive is burdening. It's driven by, the monetary constraints that they have to run under. They don't have enough time to, my dad's cardiologist, he's a great guy. I honestly, I feel bad for him because he, wants to do more and help more, but he has, like a 10-minute window where he kind of runs in the door and talks to him and, figures out what's going on. Then, pew, it's kind of like leaves the puff of smoke like the Roadrunner going out the room, and it's not for lack of empathy or trying to help. It's just because he's got a lot of patience and, he has to get basically like, heads on beds kind of a thing, get people in and out the door really quickly. And so, it's just a systemic thing, I think, that needs to be changed.
Yeah, that's part of the podcast, and that plenty of other people doing better podcasts than me trying to get some of the word out on some of this alternative health stuff, which I think is really great. But let's kind of back up here, since we kind of just got right into your motorcycle accident here. I kind of wanted to start off about, you speak pretty highly of like your dad and your dad's intelligence. I kind of wanted you to paint us a picture of like your childhood and how his like parenting style has an influence on the work you do today.
Oh God, yeah. He was, well, I mean, he's just a really freakishly brilliant guy. And it was, as a kid, he was kind of like Google before Google. I could basically ask him about anything and he usually knew the answer, which was fantastic, because I was overly curious. And so having a reference point, he had literally read every National Geographic that had been written from 1850 or 1860 when they first started through the 1960s. um, and he has an almost perfect memory. So it was really great. I mean, obviously technology changes, but as a kid, it was a fantastic resource. But I think some of the more formative things that he did is, in terms of trying to get me to think outside of the box a little bit, he always used to tell me that, most of the world is asleep. People generally aren't paying attention, and, don't be a sleepwalker. Just try and observe your environment and see what's going on and make connections and snap to. And some of the things he would do this exercises with me. Like, one of the big formative ones was he would ask me a question and say, can you solve that problem? And I'd go, no, I can't solve that problem. And he'd go, well, do you imagine in 500 years somebody will solve that problem? I'd go, well, yeah. And then I'd, kind of try and take a crack at it. And if the answer was no, he'd go, okay, well, can somebody solve that in 1,000 years? Do you think 1,000 years from now that's going to be a problem? And I go, no. And he'd go, okay, well, then just project yourself into the future, see how they solved it, then pull it back, and then, then work through it. And it was kind of an interesting thing, because when you're a little kid, you don't have those same mental constraints. And in that case, you don't have the same temporal constraints, because it's your imagination. You can just think whatever and whenever, and kind of get a picture of, what the future looks like. I mean, look at Gene Roddenberry. We're basically doing so many of the things that were done in Star Trek now, and guys like Tesla. I mean, what, in 1908 or something, at the IEEE convention, he was talking about how in the future you'd be able to have a device in your pocket that you could see people with and communicate with real time on the other side of the world. And he was panned. They wrote him up in the newspapers as being completely insane and a nutter for saying something like that. And, now, I mean, you and I are literally doing that right now. And that's, and that's just kind of the issue. So for my dad, kind of pushing the bounds on that was great. And, he had me watch this series, which is still to date my favorite series of all, called Connections. And it was by this British journalist named James Burke. And what it would do is it would take one concept that we have in the world today, and it would trace it back to its inception. And then it would follow the steps incrementally. And the reason that was incredibly formative to me is I realized that, so technology isn't somebody just coming up with some brilliant idea. It's usually this additive system where you take something and then you modify it a little bit, and then you modify it a little bit more. And I think in part, it's one of the reasons that I really enjoy jazz, is because you have kind of rather than classical music where everything is, prescribed and you have all of the notes written out for you, jazz, you have kind of a structure, you've got your chord structure, and then you figure out how you can move thematically inside of that to create or demonstrate what it is you're trying to say musically. And it's kind of the same deal with both, improvisational jazz, and for me, chemistry or biochemistry or physics or whatever the particular science du jour is. It's kind of like, what do I have to do to have enough kind of acumen in that particular field so that I can flow through and demonstrate whatever it is I'm trying to demonstrate. And all of that goes back to the basic idea of seeing that, no man is an island, it's an additive function, and we progress through time. So that was beneficial. And then one of the huge things was, when I was a kid, I had really horrific migraine headaches. I had scans and tests, and nobody could figure out what was going on. So on a whim, my dad said, well, let's try this new biofeedback therapy. And neurofeedback was just like super cutting edge then. It was very, very new. And so I ended up getting hooked up to, all this biofeedback gear and doing that all the time, so I could get a grasp on the headaches, because they were truly debilitating. Like, I was having migraine headaches like 3-4 times a week. So I'd come home from school, go in my room, cut out the lights, put an ice pack on my head, and sometimes just kind of cry myself to sleep because of the pain. And it was brutal. I mean, it was really brutal. But once they hooked me up to all that gear, man, after a couple of weeks, I was like, oh, well, this is interesting. All the things that they told me were autonomous, like your respiration and your heartbeat and your body temperature, they're all controllable. And when you have a readout, and you can see what you're doing, you become very adept at actually controlling all of those seemingly, or supposedly autonomous nervous system functions. So that was huge. And I really actually think that was maybe one of the more formative things, because it got me, to the point where I understood you're capable of exerting control over all of these things that you're told you can't exert control over. And so it kind of bred a degree of skepticism, first principles sort of a thing, where I'd look at it and go, well, okay, if that's actually the case, how much of the other things I'm being told that aren't possible are possible? And that actually was really great too. And then one of the other biggies was he gave me this book about enhancing your genius. And, because I used to ask him, like, how is it that you know so much about so much? And he said, oh, that's easy, brain nibbling. I said, the hell's brain nibbling? And he said, well, whenever I'm interested in something, I devour as much information as I can about that topic. And what I didn't know at the time, I understand now, but when you have an emotional component to whatever it is you're learning, like a very deep emotional component, if you're really into it, it drops into long-term memory and you don't forget it and you have access to it. It's kind of like if somebody asked you what the favorite part of your favorite movie is, you don't have to think about it because it was very emotional to you. So it's locked. You have it and you'll always have access to it. And so if you do that with almost everything and, you stimulate your kind of consumption of the information and all the data sets while you're really into it and actually has meaning to you emotionally, it doesn't go away. And that's really true. And I mean, as time went on, I started meditating, and meditation was probably the single biggest change in my entire existence, because that really opened up not just my mind, but my heart a lot. And that's actually, I think, the more compelling component is, there are a lot of brilliant people, but there aren't a lot of brilliant people who have really big hearts. I mean, if there were, the world would probably be starkly operating in contrast to what it's doing now, but that was big. And a lot of that was him. And, my mom, though, she was just all heart. And so it was kind of, I had sort of the academic push and the mental push from my dad, but my mom was just like the kindest, most loving, person. And she's a blues singer and a jeweler, and which is great. When my kids were young, I would take them over to see my mom, and she'd be doing things, and she'd go, "Grandma's got a gig, gotta go," and my daughter actually just sent me a clip of my mom doing Mardi Gras classics. I grew up in New Orleans, so she, sent over a thing, and I was like, "Oh, what's this?" And I looked at it, and I was like, "Oh, that's my mom singing. That's very cool," which is kind of hip, So she kind of filled in the artistic side and the very just big open heart side. So those were incredibly formative things. And I digressed a bit with the book on stimulating your genius. One of the things that it said to do when you go through it was, if you're going to be operating at the very edge of the capacity of what people think is normal, then a lot of times you're going to seem like a complete idiot, right? People are going to think you're an absolute nutter. And, case in point, some of the work that I've been doing lately is all in quantum biology. And we've just done 3 experiments back to back where we very definitively showed that we're able to elicit upwards of 20% jumps in ATP output in double-blinded controlled studies at a university, from 10,000 miles away. And it's remarkable, right? Nobody really understands exactly how it's working. I have some pretty good theories on it, but it'll probably be quite a while before it's sussed out. But that's so cutting edge that it seems kind of silly to people a lot of times. And I think that's one of those things where you have to have kind of a thick skin. So in this case, the exercise in the book to get beyond this was to go into a crowded public place and to make loud animal sounds, right? which was, I picked the Barnes and Noble right by where I lived in Westlake in Austin, and went in and did exactly that, and just which, and people look at you like, who is this jackass? And it's true, like that's something that happens. But at the end of the day, it was kind of, you take the sort of the stoic approach, like the Seneca bit of like, what can really be stripped away from you? Well, I didn't die, nothing really bad happened. Yeah, these guys looked at me like I'm a complete dumbass, but that's okay, right? It didn't materially affect me or injure me, so I'm all good. And that was actually pretty formative too, because at the end of that, you realize like, oh, okay, I can do this. I don't mind if people think I'm an idiot, because a lot of times, and I tell the guys in my lab, they sometimes are like, wow, it's amazing. You pulled this off. And I'm like, yeah, well, Right, but you didn't see the 50 times that it completely failed. I mean, it looks great, but I'm actually taking the approach of fail fast, fail often. And very frequently I'll try things that seemingly are really stupid, and people think they're just really idiotic ideas. But very often that's the thing, is people haven't gone down kind of the road less taken, because they do seem silly and people don't want to be ridiculed. And at this point, I don't really mind. I mean, my goal is to try and move the needle for humanity, and knock out a couple of big problems before I die. And if I can do that, great. And if people call me a complete fool for trying weird things to that end, so be it. I'm good with that. So all those things kind of combined, per your question, those were the things that were really formative, and left me in a space where I felt like, okay, I was well tooled to this end. And some of the stuff was even a little more esoteric, that things that you wouldn't know, like trying to, pick out colors with your eyes closed, or feel the colors, and I remember my dad doing this with me. Probably, I'm trying to remember what year it was. I think it was 1989, and we were driving in a car at night. And he said, "Okay, Roop, I want you to tell me what the color is of the car coming up from behind us." And it was, very far in the distance. And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Color emits a frequency, whether it's bouncing off of visible spectrum or infrared." He said, "There's a temperature that's being emitted there, whether you can see it or not. Feel it." And I said, "Well, what color is the car?" And he told me the color of the next car is coming. And sure enough, when they would come, and all I could see was headlights in the distance. And sure enough, when they would come up, the cars were that color. And I was like, "What? How does this work?" And and so that seemed very fringe. I mean, there's actually some people that do that kind of stuff now, where they will train you to see with your eyes closed, which is very doable. At the time, I didn't, cognitively understand what was going on. Now I do, but it was very fringe if you think about it, but it's also very tangible. It does, just because it's not in the normal lexicon that people hit and say like, "Oh yeah, sure, it's a blah, blah, blah," and they have all the wording to describe it. It doesn't really matter. It's still part of reality. Just because we don't understand physics, I mean, 1,000 years from now, I'm sure all of that stuff will be very well described. And literally in the other room, I have a thing called an M drive that people call, an impossible engine, which is ludicrous. It's not an impossible engine. It's literally in the other room, and it works like a champ. The problem is, people think that it violates laws of physics. It doesn't. You actually just have to understand which laws are applicable and what it's actually doing. And once you do that, I had to rewrite a bunch of formulas to actually make it viable. But once you do that, you can actually build the thing, and then it works. And that's, I don't know, it's not that difficult, really. It's just not common right now. So I guess the big picture there is, don't worry about being, laughed at. Just keep being open and keep pushing the bounds. And if you do that, you'll end up being probably reasonably bright.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. I've actually heard Tim Ferriss talk about that book before, and doing the animal noises in public and stuff. And I don't know if it's just my zodiac sign or what happened, but I have this natural just inside of me. Like, I've literally, as a little kid or whatever, I've really never cared what other people have thought of me. I don't know where it comes from, but I see it in a lot of people, and I always think, man, I wonder why do they care so much? Because I think there's a lot of brilliant people in the world, honestly, and they don't share information. They're scared to share information. Like, what if it's wrong? Like, okay, so even if you share some information that comes out to be wrong, it was the best you knew at the time. So you were still trying to do good. You can clearly be wrong. I've been wrong about a bunch of things. I was vegan at a point. It didn't work, and tried carnivore and this and that. And now I'm back to more like paleo style. And there's supplements I used to take that I thought were like the best of the best. And now I don't even use them anymore, but I promoted them for a while or told people to take them. So it's like, you can be wrong and be steadily evolving, especially in this space where new stuff comes out all the time. But I see a lot of people get kind of locked into a bubble because they're really, really worried, in my opinion, about what someone else is going to think about them in the long run.
Oh man, in academia, that's probably the worst, because people become real stalwarts about whatever it is that they've taught. And you don't want to go, oh, my bad, that book I wrote, sorry, all wrong. Turns out complete bollocks. People don't want to do that because their ego gets attached to it. When I was teaching senior biochemistry at a university, and what I would always tell my students is science is a point on a line. The best science we have now is going to seem laughable 1,000 years from now. There might be some bits of it that carry through, but for the most part, people are going to be like, what were they thinking? I mean, if you go back 1,000 years and look at the real cutting edge stuff 1,000 years ago, we're now kind of like, oh, and I'm sure that with the acceleration, especially with machine learning and artificial intelligence coming onto the scene, the rapidity of things changing is just going to keep going up, and the hockey stick is going to become ever more and more tenuous and just keep ramping. And I think actually it's going to be really really difficult for people, but that's the thing. I'm in for the long haul. I'm going to try and hold on and keep changing and adapting so that I'd rather be thinking and saying things that are silly and not quite right than not trying to push the bounds.
100. You took the words out of my mouth. Like I kind of love this stuff because we're often challenged to think outside of and it took me a while. And I always thought especially when I was doing the vegan, I thought I did all the research, and then I've always thought I had this like cure all or the panacea, and it keeps just getting shattered. And after being shattered a few times, you get really humbled and you go, okay, we actually don't know shit, and we're just going to keep trying to figure this thing out with the best tools that we have.
It's so funny because if you go into it with that approach, like, yeah, we don't know what the fuck we're doing. It's okay because like we're trying, right? I'm trying the best I can. My intent is pure, and I'll share the data and I'll share. Like I was at the International Bio Conference in 2014, and I had just worked on this type of cancer therapeutic that was, I mean, what we were seeing was remarkable. Like these just remarkable results. And I was in this meeting with the head of one of the 10 largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And after it was over, he came up to me and we paired off and started walking together. And he said, I'm going to call bullshit. I don't think you've done what you said you've done. And I said, look, man, I'll give you all the data. I'll share it with you. And he went, nope. Don't want to see that. There's, no reason for me to look at that. And I thought, what? Why would you not want to look at that? Even if it's completely off the map and totally wrong, why would you not want to see that? Because if you can share it with your team and it pushes things forward, maybe one of those guys will make a connection and snap to that I didn't make and kind of keep things moving forward, and that was kind of the perfect example of that. But he wanted nothing to do with it, just like, no. I don't know if he was concerned about, me suing them if they infringed on something. I didn't care. I just wanted to move it forward. It was last year, actually, with kind of the evolution of that same technology, I didn't really sit idly by and just leave it there. I kept working on it, and last year I was meeting with a group out of India, and they had developed a testing mechanism whereby they were using machine learning and genomics and a couple of other blood tests to isolate and pre-screen for cancers. And they could see when people had cancer from, basically stage 0 all the way through stage 4, and they could type it. And the government of India had given them a test and said, okay, we're going to give you 500 of our records, see what you come up with. And they ran it through and they got 500 out of 500 correct. And then the next time they did it, the government wanted them to do it again. Same thing, 500 out of 500, both type and classification correct. So they nailed it. And so I talked to them, and I was just going to give them my cancer therapeutic because I thought, if you don't do that, you're kind of a dick. I mean, like if you've got something where you can help that many people, help that many people. But at the end of the day, companies are so weird. Like they won't. They're more worried about dollars and cents than they are about the quality of people's lives and things like that. And it's just super perplexing to me. Like I don't understand why you can't get something to jive when literally you're trying to move the needle for humanity, right? Like at the end of the day, if I can save a bunch of people's lives and the people that they care about's lives, that's viable. That's a life well lived. If I have a new toy, cool, but not not really, would I rather have a Gulf Stream or 1,000 people alive? Definitively 1,000 people alive, you know.
Yeah, no, I really actually admire that about you, and I wanted to touch on that. Is that you trying to everything you put out, like save humanity and help people and try to cut down on some of these diseases? Has that always been a passion, or have you kind of curated that over time? Is there something that
No,
sparked that?
it wasn't always a passion. Yeah, there have actually, again, the meditation thing, not to hinge on it too greatly, but I am very different than I was 20 years ago, both internally. I mean, I was always a reasonably bright guy, but I couldn't do the things that I can do now. Cognitively, I'm fundamentally a different animal than I was then. The things that I'm capable of now would have blown me away and left me kind of awestruck back then. I just didn't think they were even possible. Just the rapidity with which I can, consume data and then remember it and then synthesize it and put it together and kind of recapitulate it for whatever particular science I'm working in. I didn't even think that was a thing that was possible. But, over time with enough, work and meditation and focus, things just sort of evolved. And I think, effectively at this point, I've done pretty close to 30 years of diehard meditation. And through some of those periods, a very large amount, 4 or 5 hours a day kind of a thing. And it's formative. I mean, it's very, or I should say transformative, both. Once you kind of transform, then you sort of take shape in a different format. And the big component of that was my heart at a certain point opened up. And that's not, kind of a euphemism. There was a point where it actually felt as if it shattered and opened up. And on the other side of that, my perspective was entirely different. I wasn't able to any longer move forward with the same isolation that I was prior to that. There was a certain degree of connection to everyone and everything else that was overwhelming. I mean, truly incontrovertible. It's difficult to actually put it into words, because when I tap into that component of things and I focus on it, it literally just makes me want to cry because I feel that open, because it just kind of it plumes open, and you feel more of a connection with other people than honestly than I would have ever thought was possible. One of the big changes for me was in the past couple of years was reading David Hawkins' Power versus Force. And that was actually kind of the final straw that sort of cracked me open. And it was literally, I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing. I was headed to visit a friend of mine who's a neurosurgeon. And I was driving down I-35 going from my lab in Tulsa, headed to Austin. And I was listening to the audiobook for Power versus Force. And I was driving down the road, and at a certain point, my arm kind of whipped up into, what's termed a mudra, but it literally, of its own accord, whipped up and locked into position. And I felt like the top of my head exploded, and tears just started streaming down my face. And for a second, I thought, "Am I having a stroke?" This is really odd. I've lost tangible control of half of my body. What is going on? And then it kept going, and it was just kind of this overwhelming sensation. I just felt like I was flooded with so much love. I mean, that's really the only way to describe it. It's just kind of overwhelmed with love. And it happened once that day, so much so that I pulled off the road, and it was very intense. And then it kept happening every day, and more and more and more. And then it actually became a persistent state, and then it ceased going away. And then there was another transition beyond that, and then another transition beyond that. And they were, every time that one layer of the onion came down, it was more engaging and more compelling for me to just release. Now, that's not to say that it wasn't painful. I mean, to be honest, the things they don't tell you when you're kind of on the path where you're trying to be, more than the normal, I think, consciousness kind of gives you when you're born, and you're trying to open up your consciousness and expand your awareness. They don't tell you a couple of things. Some of them are very painful, like the transition points where you have to release things. the things that you're releasing are brutal. And you've spent a lifetime or better amassing those particular psychological and emotional kinks and hangups. And when you release those, it's brutal. You actually have to work through them. You can't transition to the next level and still maintain those things. You have to release them. And sometimes it is, the comparison of how bad it felt to physically face plant at 65 miles an hour and have my leg move inside of the other leg comparatively was a cakewalk compared to what it felt like to move through and release some of the psychological and emotional kinks that had to be taken out to progress to the next point. And what I would just say is kind of the evolution that everybody goes through eventually. So, or I would hope everybody goes through it eventually.
Yeah, one can hope. And yeah, I've had similar experience. My first time kind of dealing with that was in mushroom ceremony. Actually, I used to similar background, kind of like Luke, just a bunch of drugs and partying, and then kind of got on the sober path and was doing the meditation and the yoga, and I was getting a little bit more clear and a little bit more, emotional regularity, a little heart opening with those practices. And so then studying a lot of Tim Ferriss's work back a while ago, I decided to try a mushroom ceremony. And boy, you think you're just going to get enlightened, but shedding all the emotion and that baggage that you have, it's rough. And you go through it. It's not like people think you take these mushrooms and you come out the other side as this enlightened being. It takes like days to process all the childhood trauma. And there's been a couple experiences in psychedelic states where I felt as if it was a past life, like something holding on to me that I didn't even experience myself, that I was letting go. And people think I'm a quack for saying that, but that's just what it felt like in the moment. I was like, because there wasn't actually any, like, my entire body was shaking and convulsing, and I didn't have any actual like emotional stuff from my life coming up. It felt as if like spirits or something from a different lifetime were kind of leaving my body in some way, shape, or form. And it sounds bizarre, but that's just what it felt like. And I've been changed ever since.
Well, again, it may sound bizarre, but for anybody who's gone through that process, one of the things that you don't get told is the first steps. You have to release everything that you've amassed in this lifetime. The second level, you have to release everything that you've amassed in the totality of them. And that's, and again, people can think what they want, but that's just my personal experience. So, it's kind of like people will ask about, so you think the reincarnation is a thing? And I said, yeah, I do. As much as I think kindergarten was a thing. My body looked a little different. You probably wouldn't really recognize me then. I'm substantially larger than I was, and I sound different, but yeah, same basic soul. It makes sense if you think about it in terms of the idea of all things is generally to evolve and to grow and to progress. Why would it not be different with the basic intent of what is a human? When a consciousness embodies itself in something physical, most people, the way we're taught is scholastically is, like you have a brain, your brain thinks, the complex system of thoughts aggregates to form a neural net. That neural network creates higher order thoughts. And that's why you have a consciousness, which at this point I think is absolutely ludicrous. That's, physicality is the epiphenomenon of consciousness, not the other way around. You have a body because you have an awareness and then a consciousness, not the other way around. And a lot of the things that I'm able to do and solve and get through really quickly, I'm able to do those things because I'm starting from a different standpoint. If you start from the standpoint of physicality first and consciousness second, you're kind of hosed out of the gate. You can't really approach it that way. It's kind of like releasing emotional trauma for people. Yeah, can you do it just biochemically by numbing them out enough? Sure. If the issue is something that's purely biochemical, if the issue is something that's truly deep-seated or rooted emotionally, you're not going to get that out. I don't care what kind of, technique you use or however you do it. You're going to have to do the emotional release and the work on your consciousness before you can actually get to a point where you're stable. And it might sound crazy to a lot of people, but I don't expect anybody to, believe that or take my word for it, sit down and practice it. The thing I love about meditation is it is quite literally one of the most scientific things you can imagine. If you sit down and you put in the time and you do the work, you will get the result, period. Most people I think stop because they go like, oh, I still have thoughts, I'm not doing it correctly. That's not the point. Everyone has thoughts. At the moment at which you're in, like nirvikalpa samadhi, or which is just the term for kind of where everything is stabilized and you no longer really think in the same path. It's the world is very different at that point, but linearity is not really a thing. You see things more from both sides, and it's not your consciousness moving sequentially from point to point to point, and also in a sort of separate way. Things are much more collective, right? And the perspective there is very different. The normal perspective that you grow up with, everything is, you're told that it's a delineation moving forward. Well, if you just sit down and meditate, I guarantee you at a certain point, those thoughts will disappear. Your awareness will shift out. You'll lose, your sort of physical focus, and you'll start to have experiences. And then when you come back, that'll happen again. And the more you do that consistently, the easier it becomes to elicit those states on the daily. And after decades of doing it, you are just fundamentally different. Your brain operates differently. I mean, you can look at someone's fMRI, if they've meditated for, a couple of decades. There was a great research group that did that, looking at monks, and they were using a baby crying as a stimulus, because we're effectively hardwired biologically so that when a baby cries, your brain immediately has kind of a reactive issue where it wants to, hears the sound, and then you have an impulse to move. Well, for people who've meditated for a few decades, it's different. The fMRI would light up in the cortex where you receive the sound. So the auditory stimuli comes in, but then rather than everyone else, where they immediately have this motive force that's exhibited where they have to move forward, you have the time to process and say, what is the best action to take? So you become an active creature as opposed to a reactive creature. And there's a lot of benefit in that. You're like, case in point, when you're coming down, face first into the ground at 65 miles an hour, you can go, okay, well, so this is what ground looks like at 65, which quite literally I was like, as it was going into slow-mo with my face coming down to the ground, I was kind of acutely aware of what it looked like. And I thought, well, this is an interesting perspective, which sounds silly, but there was a certain inherent beauty in it. And I was able to do that as opposed to just, which was nice. And I think in great part, that's probably why I didn't lose consciousness, and why things were not so rough. I was able to fundamentally disassociate from the physicality and the pain of what was going on and say, okay, yeah, I'm getting physical input. That's fine. I know, you've done, Hape and Sananga and Combo. And with the Sananga, which is, for people who don't know what it is, it's kind of the effectively like pepper spraying your own eyes. You're using something similar to capsaicin, and you're putting them in concentrated drops in your eyes. And it's actually got tremendous benefits for your eyes. You can kind of overclock your ability to see at night. And which sounds odd, but the military actually worked on a project that was similar to that, where they used chlorophyll derivative drops, and they would put them in people's eyes, and then they could see at night. And another group, kind of as an aside, did the same thing with retinol A derivative drops, and they would put them in people's eyes, and they could see like an insect on the other end of the spectrum. So instead of the normal, 300 nanometer bandwidth that you typically get, you were getting, like probably between the two of those, you could get 800 to 900 nanometer bandwidth, which is great, because then, you have all this onboard hardware that allows you to do stuff that you don't normally have access to the compounds to trigger the release of. But in this case, it was a very interesting function to, I don't know, turn those bits on and allow something that is outside of the norm to occur. And that just happens consistently, if you push the bounds.
Yeah, for sure. You must be a mind reader, because I was going to selfishly ask about your combo experience being a practitioner. And I know you've dabbled in a lot of random supplements and everything. I wanted to know how you felt with your combo experience and what you got out of that.
I loved it. Todd Shipman did mine, and he's done a bunch of them. I actually had my entire staff or anybody who wanted to do it.
Yeah, you can't really force that one on anyone.
Yeah, no, it was. I had them watch the video on biohackers with the
that's a good one.
Yeah, the women from Higher Dose, Lauren and Katie, and half of the guys were like, "Wow, that looks amazing," and then half of them were like, "Yeah, that's going to be a hard pass. I don't want to spend the next hour vomiting." And it was really interesting. I think for me, the best part was when I was kind of going through what I described after I had listened to that Hawkins book and kind of cracked open a bit. There's one of the things that I had to work through was surrender, and which in the West, right, for a guy when you're kind of like you're running a company and you're doing all this stuff, the idea of surrender is sort of antithetical to what we're really told we're supposed to do. You're supposed to kind of be the alpha guy and do all this stuff, and I realized that in order to move forward, I had to truly surrender. And so I was thinking of like, oh, well, how can I demonstrably show that I'm surrendering everything, physicality, mentality, the whole 9 yards? And one of the things was I thought, oh, Sananga, that's brutal. I'll do that. So I went to see Todd and had Todd do the Sananga. And I laid down and he put the drops on my eyes and I just laid there and I surrendered all of the sensations, everything physical. And when I got up, and this will probably mean a lot more to you since you're a practitioner than other people, and you should ask him about it because he still thinks it's very bizarre.
We've talked about it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. He was kind of dumbfounded because he said, I didn't think that was possible. Like there was no change. Like your heart rate didn't change, your respiration didn't change, your musculature didn't change, your eyes didn't twitch. And I said, yeah, that's because I surrendered it, right? Like I had to let go of everything. And I did. And then oddly, when I was done, I said, I think I need to do it again. And Todd laughed and said, wow, that's a first. Nobody's ever done Sananga and then asked to do it again right after that. But I did it a second time because it was necessary. But I will also say I have probably never seen a more beautiful sky than when I left after that, because the colors that you can pick up, oh my God, it was amazing. I know it was probably objectively just a normal cloudy gray sky in Florida that day, but when I came out, I was picking up hues of blue and purple and violet and things that it was probably what a tetrachromat, somebody that has 4 cones in their eyes, it's probably what a tetrachromat feels like all the time. They see all of these variations and shades to a very great degree, as opposed to the rest of us who are just kind of, red, blue, green. But it was amazing. What was your experience with it?
Yeah. So the first time I did it, it was just like a practitioner coming over, and but when I really realized the Sananga, like with the vision, is during training. So I was out in the mountains in California in Lake Arrowhead, so tip top of a mountain. So when we would have when we would have breaks, we would like go up hiking into the mountain, do some hape, do some Sananga, because we were doing hape like every day because we were trying to learn how to administer it and then trying to do some self-administration. So it was part of the training. So we were just like doing Sananga and hape every day just to learn how to dabble with it. But I remember texting my wife from the mountain and goes, I don't think I've ever been able to see this clear. Like I was doing Sananga every day and then going on these little hikes, and it was just sunny and beautiful in the mountain, and it was just bizarre. And I don't have any issues with I've never had to wear glasses or contacts or anything. It was just, you were seeing something different from the Sananga.
Yeah, 100%. That's why I had, made the comment about those chlorophyll and retinol A derivative drops, is we have the capacity to see a lot more than we normally see, but they're not stimulated. I know that the origin of the Sananga was the guys in the Amazon would use it so that they could hunt at night. And oh my God, I completely understood it after doing it, because I see the same thing. Like I said, most beautiful sunset I've ever seen, most beautiful sky. Just, it was like something turned all of my vision into 4K. I went from a black and white TV to 4K, and I was like, oh my God. And the hape is really remarkable too. The ethnobotanist who first worked on the hape made some claims about it that I'm sure a lot of people would have a problem with, but he talked about how it temporally displaced him. You know, he would do the Hoppe, and they did, I think, 18 rounds of it, you know, one after the other.
Wow.
And yeah, and at the end of that, he was able to see where they had to be the next day for their hunt. And he had an image of, you know, these boars jumping over a hollowed out log at a specific spot in the river. And so the you know, the shaman that was administering it said, okay, well, you're leading the hunt tomorrow, you know, take us where your vision told you to go. And he said that, you know, he went to that point, and sure enough, at exactly the right moment, six boars jumped over a hollow log, and he saw exactly what he had seen in the vision. And it's intriguing to me because I say temporal displacement, but you know, time, again, from my perspective, isn't as linear as everybody makes it out to be. And I think there are two things that are possibly happening there. You're either expanding your conscious awareness so that you see what's happening in the future, or you're simply moving forward with your consciousness and collapsing the waveform so that it ceases to be a possibility and becomes a probability, and then becomes something that's tangible. You know, so you go from, you know, kind of Schrodinger to Dirac, and you lock down the waveform, you know, as it were, in the physics terms. So you collapse the wave function.
Yeah, that's amazing. And people always think it sounds a little crazy. So my wife and I, we host these retreats, and it's kind of all centered around kind of getting out of your comfort zone. So we have like ecstatic dance, and then there's a lot of yoga practice and a lot of journaling around letting go. And then also it's mixed with the fact that we're out in nature, so they're out of their normal life, so they actually have time to process and think. And then we do a cacao ceremony on day 2 with this amazing breath work and sound facilitator that's been doing it for decades. She's been doing altered state breath work for like 20-30 years. She's like 60 years old. She's cool as hell. And so then we kind of break them through that. And then on Sunday morning, we do the combo. So like everything's been kind of building on top of each other. And then Sunday morning, they do the Hape, the Sananga, and the combo with a lot of the intention setting. So you see it actually become a lot more powerful in the retreats, in my opinion, because we've kind of broken them out of their shell. The intention's been there, the release has been there, the breath work kind of helps them break open even more. And usually after they do the breath work, they're like, shit, I'm ready for combo. Because the breath work, in my opinion, can be harder, because my practitioner will really push them hour and a half style breath work, you know? So like they're really getting deep, and they're all crying and emotional. So by the time they do the combo and they set intention around that and all of the other things, it's been pretty powerful. We've done about 3 or 4 of those, and I've seen some pretty good results and gotten some great feedback from doing it in that type of setting, instead of just like a normal combo ceremony at my house, which is still powerful. People breaking out, you know, taking a couple hours to kind of get uncomfortable and getting the peptides and the medicine. Very, very powerful by itself, but I've seen a lot better results through the weekend style retreats.
Oh, without a doubt. I think taking yourself, you know, both mentally and physically out of your comfort zone, putting yourself in a new environment, you know, that's one of the things that's interesting about mantras, is you generally don't want a mantra that has meaning to you, because you ascribe something to it, right? You mentally have a hold on it. And similarly, physicality in the space that you're normally residing in, same thing. You know how you're going to fit on that couch, in that chair, on that floor. If you're in nature and it's a completely new environment, you don't have the same points of bearing. And because of that, you are de facto more uncomfortable with your state. And that allows you to be more pliable just by nature.
Yeah, and a lot of times, you know, like I get people like, I had this one guy, he's like, am I going to be able to go back to work after the combo ceremony? I'm like, I like, I'm like, so I think sometimes when they just come do it at my place, even though it's like, you know, real intentional and it's thought out and everything's great, sometimes I think they just dive right back into the same shit, you know, pick up my kids, cook dinner. Like they don't really sit with it or think about it. So when we do it in the retreat space, everyone gets time, and they've already been kind of writing out their goals and their intentions. So it really takes them out of their normal routine, because some people just dive right back into real life after going through an experience like that. And I don't think they really process it.
It's a perfect time for me to pitch my new company, Afternoon DMT. You leave work and you do a drive-through DMT hit, and then go back to work.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Failed
that's what
business
DMT is called, the
venture,
businessman's.
5,200.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's how like people, they don't even want to give themselves like a full day, like even just one day, take a nap, process it, sit with it. They want to go right back into whatever they were doing just because the combo ceremony is a lot shorter than like ayahuasca or any other psychedelic spaces. So I'm just like, yeah, I mean, maybe you can go back to work, but I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, I don't see why you would, just afford yourself the ability to grow. I mean, that's the whole purpose of all this stuff, right? Like a lot of guys, I think Joe Dispenza does it pretty well with, taking people out of their comfort zone for days on end. Also, just the way they do their meditations where they wake people up at 4 a.m. so that they're kind of operating at the peak capacity for melatonin output so they can convert it to DMT when they do, big meditations. That's a really good stroke because people lose the reference to like, oh, I'm doing this, I'm working all day, every day. They're away from their phones, they're meditating for a ton of the time, they're doing breath work, and they're doing it around other people collectively. And there's, consciousness is a lot like a bed sheet. If you pull up one spot on it, the spots closest to it get moved pretty substantially. And so if you have a large collective kind of people doing that stuff together, it moves the awareness of all of those people, with a pretty high degree of simultaneity. I mean, you can really like level everybody up. And if you do it, where you're programmatically setting it up at 4 a.m. so that people are really hitting, the peak potential of DMT, endogenously, then they're going to have what they consider to be super profound experiences. I mean, because pretty much, you have anandamide and DMT, you got all these onboard compounds that trigger truly psychedelic states that normally you don't access. One of the only time I had ever wanted to try a heavy drug when I was a kid was when they were doing it in my school drug education days. The counselor passed out this pamphlet, and this was probably horrible because I was a big time musician, and they passed out this pamphlet and it said, don't do LSD, it'll do this and this and this, and you'll see sounds as colors. And I went, I'm sorry, hang on a second. Sounds as colors? Really? Let's put a pin in that. That sounds kind of cool. And
noted.
Yeah. And so I have since had that experience. I was playing sax one day, and I literally had just this huge moment of cross synaptic synesthesia where everything crossed, and suddenly it was kind of like being inside a Monet painting. Everything I was playing was a color, and it was amazing. I mean, it was great, but it was, I arrived at it through, same thing, years of meditation, and it just happened, spontaneously. It kicked off, and it was beautiful. Like, one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And it was great. And luckily I didn't have to, do LSD to do that, because it was, just something that happened organically on its own, probably because I put the intent out there that I would have liked to have experienced it. And then it just kicked in. Also, an aside, on the same drug education day in high school, and this is the mentality of people when they're in high school, they said, oh, don't you think it'd be really difficult to have a job? There was this one kid in my class named Rock, and Rock said, and he was a total stoner, total drug, and he goes, actually, I have 2 jobs. I will probably, it's been like 30 years, I will probably never forget that, because I was just like, oh, dude, really?
That's amazing.
Yeah. One of the funniest, just like he was so oblivious to what was going on. Actually, I have 2 jobs. So yeah, very funny.
That's amazing. And had you had been on LSD when you were playing the sax, you would have probably lifted to another dimension right there. A little microdose when them colors were coming out. It might have been overbearing. It might have been too much.
Yeah, no, I was like an Uber Boy Scout. I didn't do any psychedelic until I was in my late 40s, because I had always wanted to go for just absolute clarity and purity. And, I didn't eat meat for 28 years. And, it was, and it wasn't an exercise in anything biological, because biologically speaking, you're far better off if you do have healthy meats and proteins and fats. And even environmentally, it's a more sound approach. But it was just something I didn't want to do, because I didn't want to have to, deal with the consciousness of another critter. But ultimately, I ended up having to start eating meat, because, humorously enough, because of exactly what my consciousness was doing at the time. You start to become too ephemeral, and it's difficult to actually maintain your grasp on tangible reality beyond a certain point. And meat is great because it slows you down. And that's, I mean, I'll probably get some blowback from people saying, you can't say that. Actually, it's true, like, and even if you go to Ayurvedic medicine and you look at, like the Pitta Vata Kapha, and then, like what's going on there. Well, meat is very kapha. It's going to slow you down. It's also tamasic, and it's the rajasic, tamasic, and, for the longest time, I would do things that were just very, very ephemeral and light, and sattvic is the term, kind of the highest foods, just milk, honey, almonds, ghee, oranges, that kind of stuff, the highest vibration foods I could get, because I was shooting for absolute clarity. And then it's kind of funny, because I had always joked if I ever hit the threshold I was shooting for, that I would eat meat. And turns out I kind of had to, because I started to become so disassociated from my physical form that I was literally having to look to see where my body was, because you really do. It's kind of, it sounds sort of like you're having some psychological break, or you're being horribly disassociative, but it's really not. What's actually happening is you just identify with something different at that point. And so I would literally have to look down and go, okay, all right, that's where I'm at. Got it. And then get myself to move. And once I started eating meat, that was no longer a concern. It slowed me down enough that I felt like I was kind of grounded out physically again. So it was a great tool. And also of important note, bacon is tasty. So
100%. I feel a lot better once I started eating meat again myself, and it does seem very grounding. And in today's world, it's almost like we need a bit of grounding with all the stimulus and everything going on. And I definitely feel way more connected and in my body. I did feel when I was like vegan, vegetarian, there, like during meditation, there was like some form of like light, like you kind of explained, lightness or like higher consciousness almost, that I was tapping into a little bit. But then in the long term, especially because I was diehard vegan, wouldn't even do the milk or cheese or eggs or anything, just started getting terrible like hormone issues and gut dysfunction and all of that. So then kind of went back to like the more paleo lifestyle.
yeah, I was only like a diehard vegan for about 3 years, and then I was vegetarian for another 25. But I did dairy and eggs, and that,
Yeah, I think you can get by with the
yeah.
dairy and eggs a lot longer.
Well, yeah, and I also supplemented like a mama jamma. I tried to apply what I know and make sure that I had enough of this and that. And you really do. You can't. Cheetos are vegetarian. Diet Coke is vegetarian. You
Right.
can't take that approach, because people get really tragically unhealthy if they do that sort of thing. So I did actually think about what I was doing, and try and make sure I had enough nutrients and things like that. But ultimately, I didn't stop eating meat because of something biological, and I didn't start eating meat because of something biological. It was just it was really more of, again, more of a function of consciousness. It was a necessary tool for me. At one point I had to put it down, and then another point I had to pick it up. It's kind of like the Buddha's idea of once you make it to the other side of the river, you don't carry the raft on your head. Like use it for the purpose. And food was something that had a purpose, and then at a certain point it didn't have a purpose again, and then I just transitioned to a different style. And I think the other funny part about that is, I think a lot of people, myself included, you start to develop a kind of an ethos around whatever your dietary style is, like carnivore this, vegan that, and really that's just another thing for your awareness to kind of latch onto, and your ego to have a hold in reality. And it's pointless, like it doesn't really matter. Like you're effectively the same soul, whether you're smacking back meat or leaves. Doesn't really matter.
100%. We like to get in these camps because we feel seen or heard, or we have a community. And, as tribal creatures, I think we do kind of, yearn for that a little bit. But at the end of the day, it just puts you in a little box, and then it's not really constructive, I feel like, in the long term. And then most people kind of end up, some people do really, really well with vegan and carnivore and everything, but most people kind of find themselves back in the middle somewhere after they've kind of experimented every which way. So I know that we could sit here and keep rattling and have a 3-hour conversation about just life, but why don't we maybe reel it back in here a little bit? I kind of wanted this conversation to go like that for a little bit because you're just so knowledgeable about random things, and I like having conversation with you. But I do really want to touch on C60 and all the benefits and everything behind that. So why don't you tell everybody what C60 is and why you became so fascinated by it?
So C60 is carbon 60, and it's 60 carbon atoms clustered together in the handy shape of a truncated icosahedron or a soccer ball. So, and it's literally, it's like a nanoscopic soccer ball that's, 1.2 nanometers wide. So a very teeny soccer ball for very small soccer teams. And carbon is the backbone that our biology is oriented around. And so carbon 60 has a lot of benefits. For a long time, when people discovered it, they didn't think that it was going to have biological import because it's got a high degree of hydrophobicity. So it's not something that you can work well with aqueous solutions and water. And turns out, though, that you can bind it to a lipid. And if you bind it to a lipid, you can get it to move through cell membranes. And when it does that, the thing that's kind of nifty to me is the lipid stays towards the cell membrane side, and the nanosphere, the little soccer ball, delocalizes, and because of a differential gradient, it pulls itself to the mitochondrial membrane and wedges in the mitochondrial membrane, where it acts as an oxidative stress buffer. And so just by virtue of stopping oxidative stress, you're blocking system loss in your electron transport chain, and so it upregulates the output inside of the cell. So your mitochondria end up on the low end. What we found when we were doing the testing was low end 18%, high end 58.3% of a shift in ATP output just by virtue of stopping system loss. So I thought that was remarkable. And I started working on ways to come modulate that. And then eventually I realized, well, if I can stop this much, and get additive benefit by blocking system loss, what can I do if I start additively working on things? So I started using NAD precursors and, trying to upregulate the other side of the energetic curve there. So I started looking at all of the different complexes of the electron transport chain and isolating those and upregulating the different components so I could do that, which is one of the reasons why I think it's actually good if people take C60 and then they do red light therapy. That's great because you're hitting an additional part of the complex on the electron transport chain when you add in red light therapy, and you end up with this very robust energetic profile where you're pumping out huge amounts of ATP. And the thing that's nifty is when you start at the very core level of intracellular function, that cascades up and provides a healthier cellular function. And then, that collectively starts to work in your different organ systems. And so systemically, you basically build a better body. And over time, you end up with literally a much more robust system where you have a lot more energetic power at your capacity, or at your disposal rather. And I think physiology functions really well when you have the required energy. You can make it through most tasks and most challenges. And so that's, some of the stranger things that I saw. I did this experiment with P53 knockout mice. And P53s, that's your tumor suppressor gene. So these mice, you extract the tumor suppressor gene and then you breed them so they don't have it. And they can either have, one copy or both copies knocked out. And so in the case of what I did, I used the ones that had the shortest lifespan. And this is what we would use in oncology research is P53 knockout mice that are homozygous, like knockout, negative. They don't have any tumor suppression. So they idiopathically develop tumor presentation. And that's just kind of the science term for randomly, spontaneously developing of no specific origin tumors. And they have, because so many people use them in oncology, they have very regulated and well-determined lifespans. The mortality curve is very precise. Within a couple of weeks how, heterozygous wild type and homozygous are going to all die. And so I used the homozygous knockout and figured, okay, I've got these guys, they're going to hit it at this particular point. They'll keel over. Lo and behold, they didn't. On average, they lived 93% longer, which was remarkable. And the first necropsy, I did the first necropsy on the first mouse that died. And when I opened it up, it was very clear that it had died of a femoral hemorrhage, but I couldn't find any tumors. And I thought, well, that's very bizarre. Certainly living this long and then dying of something, it should have had tumors. Like there should have been tumors all over its entire body, but it didn't have any. And I thought, well, I don't do this all the time. I'll send it out to a veterinary pathologist and have a full histological workup done so I can see what's really there, what's going on with the cells, and they'll be able to tell. So the next one that keeled over, I put it on ice, shipped it out overnight, and had a vet pathologist go through it and do the necropsy on it. Same thing, no tumors. And then of the entire cohort, I think one had a tumor, but it didn't die of the tumor. And then one was inconclusive because it had actually been delayed getting there. So the temperature kind of screwed up the tissue because the temperature, you put them on ice and kind of need them there the next day. And it was delayed, so it was kind of inconclusive data. But overall, they still lived on average 93% longer and effectively didn't die of tumors. So that was kind of a remarkable data set, and it really put me on a path of going like, okay, well, this is different, And I had followed it up because there was a research group in Paris, headed by a guy named Fatih Musa, who had done a study. And my dad actually clued me into this one because I was looking for things on longevity at the time. And they had just published a study about C60 showing a 90% lifespan in their wild type mice. And the study ran for 5 years. And I thought, nah, that's got to be total bullshit. There's no way. Like, if anybody were able to figure out how to do a 90% lifespan extension in a mammal, everybody and their brother would be talking about it. And so I, but being reasonably open, I was like, all right, I'll get this stuff and I'll try it. So I tried it, and 93% extension. And I thought, that's not enough of a variation. That's not an anomaly. That's obviously something statistically that's relevant. If they got a 90% extension in wild type and I got a 93% in homozygous knockouts, that's kind of something worth noting. And again, this is kind of where you have to be agnostic to be, I think, really good at science. Is, I had a notion before that lifespan could be pushed to a certain point. Maybe you could push it out 10, 20%, but certainly not that much. And seeing that, I thought, damn, well, I just did the test, and, obviously that's something that we just hadn't identified, but it's very doable. Since then, my entire take on that is different. I think the idea of, 90% extension is silly. I think you can easily get a 200 to 300% extension, that was the early days of me working on that stuff. And since then, when you additively bump up the energetics inside the cells, you can do all sorts of stuff. And, I can think of, 4 or 5 different guys that are working on things where it's very clear that we're all showing age regression or postponing of aging, or, reversal of telomere shortening, and whole different sorts of things. You've got the V cells, the very small embryonic-like stem cells, which personally, I think between the carbon 60, NMN, and V cells, that's kind of like my holy trinity of longevity stuff. If you can do anything, do the 3 of those, and it will remarkably shift your entire existence. You will function as a different creature, because the V cells, for people who don't know, the very small embryonic-like stem cells, the nifty part about those is they're day 0, right? So they're autologous, they're from your own body, but they're normally quiescent, which just means they're basically asleep. They're dormant in your system. And you can reactivate them through hormetic stressors. So you hormetically stress them, activate them, and then you reintroduce them into your body. And because they have 0 telomeric degradation, they are day 0 stem cells. So it's as if you were able to find your own perfectly banked stem cells from the day you were born and then reintroduce them, which like I said, when I had my accident, I did, I think, 7 sessions in 6 weeks to rebuild the area around my knee, right where the femur had punched in. And, kind of proof's in the pudding. It really works. So between that and the carbon 60 and the other additives, like the serums that I do at Wizard Sciences, some of them are just the bases, like carbon 60 plus a different lipid. And the reason I do that in the case of, say, the Evolve is just carbon-60 and an extra virgin olive oil, right? That's your basic systemic anti-inflammatory. It'll boost ATP by blocking system loss, but that's it. Then there's another one called Elixir that is organic coconut oil bound to C60. I do that because it drops neural inflammation. And, your body moves lipids to different areas based on what type of profile it has. So, in a medium chain triglyceride is going to hit your liver, fractionate it into ketone bodies, and then you'll pull some of that to your brain, and hence you'll have a reduction in neural inflammatory response there. The olive oil, it's a long chain fatty acid, so that's going to move through your small intestine and your normal GI tract and kind of systemically distribute through the rest of your somatic cells throughout your body. And so you get kind of this overall drop in systemic inflammatory response there. But then there's the other products I have, like Neural RX, I specifically developed for people with Alzheimer's, right? And that's the one that people take for cognitive enhancement, because if you don't have some huge cognitive deficit, all of the different components that I put into that serum upregulate neural function. It changes your evoked neural potentials and all sorts of stuff. And it takes tau proteins and beta amyloid plaques and actually breaks them down into small components so that your glymphatic system, which is a small subset of your brain, and your lymphatic system can actually use interstitial fluid and cerebrospinal fluid to purge the interior of your brain. So every day you're structurally remodeling it and cleansing it. And then it also upregulates the outcroppings of neurogenesis. So you end up with new neurons on the daily at a rate that's 2 to 3x what your body would generally do with its endogenous compounds of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and NGF1, neural growth factor 1. So you outpace those things, and then you use, kind of a drop in inflammatory response to trigger a couple of other things energetically. And that whole host of things I specifically put together for Alzheimer's. But again, if you don't have a huge cognitive deficit, you end up with a more robust energy profile in your brain. And the same thing with the Olympic serum, which is one of the other compounds. That's sort of the corollary to what Neural RX is for the brain, but for the rest of the body. And it's kind of become a darling amongst, pro athletes and CrossFitters and things like that, because I literally made it for guys who were going out for the Olympics for pole vaulting. And they were looking for 1 to 2% gains, and we were getting 13 to 17% gains in energetic output. And it's funny, actually. CrossFit guys are great because they track all of their metrics. They're always doing a WOD, and they always have a PR, and they know what their numbers are. And so I get calls from CrossFitters all the time. Like this week alone, I was literally in the past 2 days talking to one of the the top 10 guys in the world, because there's so much of a difference in output, and they always want to go like, is this legal? Well, yeah, it is. It's just it's better cell function. You're just making your cells more healthy, and then in aggregate your body has more capacity. So
yeah, that's great. And so there is a kind of I always wondered that, because I would use methylene blue and then stack that with my infrared sauna with the red light. So, and I know that has a function with the ETC as well. So there is benefits to doing the C60 and then jumping in the red light session.
yeah, methylene blue, much like C60, is both a really good electron receptor and donor. So depending on the environment it's in, it can either receive or give, and that has a lot of benefits. And then with the red light, you're affecting the part of the ETC, that the complex that deals with cytochrome. And so the cytochrome P450, so you get the thing to oscillate, and then you kind of upregulate. It's basically you're forcibly advancing the cell cycle. There's a nitric oxide molecule that bonds onto the cytochrome, and it kind of slows the process down. And when you oscillate it with red light, it actually moves it by virtue of shaking it, and it gets replaced with an oxygen molecule. And so you're photonically advancing the cell cycle in the electron transport chain. So that's kind of how that functions.
That makes a lot of sense. Is there so I have methylene blue and I still use it from time to time, maybe like once or twice a week. Is there any benefits to stacking that, or should that be on a different day? How's that work?
I do it on a different day. I get that question pretty frequently with, from a lot of really avid biohackers. And I always say, just do it on a different day. It'll make you a bit jittery if you do it on the same day. I mean, that's our culture, for better or worse, is like, if 5 is good, 50 is better. Like there's kind of a diminishing return. I also, one of the other things is I also tell people, don't do the serums I make, or for that matter, any vitamin or anything. Don't do it every day. Cycle it, right? You don't want your body to become totally dependent on something, because C60 is a great antioxidant, but if you literally did it every day without breaks, well, your body's going to shut down its own production of endogenous antioxidants, and you don't want to, like, you want superoxide dismutase, you want glutathione. They're really good. You don't want to shut those down. So you time it so that you randomly intersperse it. Do 5 days on, 2 days off, 3 days on, 1 day off, whatever. Just keep it random so that your body, the same way you do a workout, really. It's systems in aggregate generally function the same way systems do in component parts, and you want to do the same sort of like hormetic stressing of the individual cells the same way that you would muscle groups. Just vary it, change it up. Then you'll end up with the most robust energy profile at the end of the day. It's just like metabolic flexibility, right? Sometimes you want to be completely keto. Sometimes you should eat some sugar, right? You don't want to do just one or the other, because you end up with an impairing of your metabolic flexibility. And really, to be truly healthy, you want to have that flexibility. And the same thing applies subcellularly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so for someone like me who was kind of dealing with some neurological stuff coming off the Lyme disease, do you recommend? I've been using it almost basically every day just because I'm still trying to work through a little bit of that neurological stuff. Do you recommend for like a period of time taking it every day and then taking a break once you feel good,
Yeah,
or should you take breaks even if you're? So you do take it for
Oh,
how long?
yeah, for something like that, that's a specific concern. It's the same thing for people that have Alzheimer's. Yeah, take it every day. Actually, for people that have Alzheimer's, I recommend that they take, 2 tablespoons at a minimum every day, which is a huge amount. For anybody that's taken any sort of MCT, that 2 tablespoons is something you have to work up to. Otherwise, it's your GI tract is just going to be obliterated. But yeah, for people with some sort of specific task in mind, yeah, like anything else, if you're doing a training for a marathon, the regimen is very different than if you're just training for general health. And so if you're working with some sort of cognitive deficit, yeah, 100% keep doing it, because you've got to both do a detoxification cycle inside yourself, because of the Lyme, as well as trying to upregulate the potentiation. So yeah, keep rocking it the way you're rocking it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And for people who are dealing with some neurological stuff, the detoxification at the beginning for me was pretty rough. I wouldn't take it on the days that I had podcasts, or I would wait until after the podcast to take it because I'd get really fatigued and tired. I actually told you that I took a tablespoon the very first day because I heard about all these like, oh, brain enhancement. Todd's telling me it's a nootropic, but it is if you're not coming off of Lyme disease. And so I take a tablespoon and I take some nootropics and I get on this podcast, and about halfway through, I'm like, man, I need some nicotine or something. Like I am literally like about to fall asleep. I didn't realize it was going to hit me that hard, but yeah, it can be pretty brutal if you're dealing with some neurological stuff in the beginning.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I think people don't realize how intense it is. But it was designed to help people that were at a massive cognitive deficit, and it does. I mean, I've seen it firsthand quite a few times. I have people who've used it with family members who have impairments, and to great benefit. I suppose I can't make any medical claim, but I can certainly point you in the direction of the doctors who've used it with their family, and they can make a medical claim. My goal was just to try and help people that were at a deficit. And most people don't have that much of a cognitive deficit, so for them it's just a nootropic. I know, since Todd and Jill, when Jill first started taking it, she was kind of in a space where she was very mentally cloudy. And I think part of the reason that she's a big proponent, as is Todd, is because she literally went from being mentally fuzzy and not able to do a whole lot to reading a book a day with flawless recall on stuff. And it was such a stark contrast that, it's been, I don't know, 2 or 3 years now, and she still takes it on the daily. And it's, I do too. I mean, I'm constantly going for a better brain, and I want to have better function and things like that. And I mean, as long as I'm in a physical body, I'm going to try and make sure that the thing is humming along and functioning really well, and with the longest longevity I can give it. And to that end, pumping your brain full of C60 seems to have some good benefit. Again, I've probably taken more of that stuff than literally any other, human for sure. Most likely any other living critter. And, so far so good. If I keel over tomorrow, I retract all of these statements and I recommend that everybody stop. But, I'm definitely the canary in the coal mine. And so far it's been great. I mean, I haven't noticed a lot of detriment. In fact, it's actually just the opposite of that. It's been a little peculiar because the way that I'm aging, I'm definitely still aging, but the way that I'm aging seems to be different than most of my friends who aren't doing it, kind of from the same group. I've noticed some very definitive changes that I'm not seeing that a lot of them are seeing. So, for being squarely in my 50s, don't I don't feel energetically compromised. I mean, I have a workload that is truly insane and I'm humming through it pretty well. And cognitively, I don't feel like I'm dropping. If anything, I feel like I'm picking up steam and enjoying it.
Yeah, the actual molecule itself just seems so interesting. Well, especially because you blend it with these other kind of energetic boosters. We'll get into some of those, like the NMN and all that stuff. But it seems to kind of regulate cellular function, get things moving, antioxidant. So it's like kind of buffering the oxidative
Mhm.
stress that we're all dealing with from just current lifestyle and the environmental stressors. And then also it's also a binder, right? So it's also detoxifying what's in your body as well. So it's got like so many different mechanisms that it works on. It's kind of insane.
Well, it's renally and hepatically protective. So, your kidneys and your liver are really buffered. And it's interesting actually. Like if you try and knock out a lab mouse that's taken it, you use a thing called CCl4, carbon tetrachloride, and you have to up the amount to knock them out that you normally use, like two and a quarter times or so what you'd normally use, because it binds and processes through the system so quickly that they just keep a humming, and it's very protective against radiation too, which is great. We were doing some experiments with thorium around the lab, and my team was very very reluctant to move too close since it was pegging the Geiger counter, and this may just be, it may sound kind of brazen, but I knew because I've read the studies and I had, kind of known the quantities and what the data set was. I wasn't worried about it, So if need be, I just walk up and deal with the stuff as opposed to kind of going, ah, when the Geiger counter goes off, everybody winces and backs away. I just figured, I can handle the load. It's not that I'm going to sign up to go, like pitch a tent in Fukushima and chill out at Chernobyl, but, but it's still it definitely, based on the studies that I've seen, it's really amazing how well that molecule seems to stabilize our own physiology in a beneficial way. I don't know if I could say stabilize beyond a certain threshold. I think it stabilizes it initially when you don't have it in your system. I think it's kind of rebuilding things and reformatting things. But at a certain point, I feel like it becomes a very stable function. One of the stranger things is I did a clinical trial probably 8 years ago with 50 different animals, 50 dogs. And it was in two phases. The first was safety and toxicity, and the next was efficacy and dosing. And when I got the blood work back, I did a full cytokine panel on all the dogs. And I didn't understand how it shifted. It really precipitously dropped all the cytokines. But the other thing was just the CBC, the normal blood workup, the Kim 20. All of the levels that were high dropped into normal range, and all the levels that were low elevated to normal range. And I, at the time, I didn't really understand, how adaptogens worked, but that's effectively what it really seemed like, is like, wow, this is a pretty phenomenal adaptogen. It's doing, and it's because of the ability to either accept or donate electrons. I think that it does that, but it kind of fits, in the missing spot, fills the void, if you will, biologically. And because of that, it's just, it's, I'm sure at some point somebody will find something better, but so far it's the best thing I've seen. Like if I wish I could drop the price on it a lot so I could just make it more and more ubiquitous. I mean, I'm actually working on new methods of production so that I can do that, because I think once people realize the inherent benefit of it, more and more people are going to want it. And right now we're kind of in that early adoption phase where really there's probably less than 1% of the people that it's really applicable for are actually using it. And then so I'm kind of, boom, boom, beating the drum, trying to get the word out. But eventually I'd like to really drop the bottom out of the costs so that instead of being, $60,000 a kilo, it's, $60 a kilo. Because that's when you're going to be able to make a dent and get it out to everybody and get it on the shelves at, Costco and Walmart and stuff like that. Prior to that, it's the domain of the biohackers and the people who are, trying to overcome some sort of ailment or something like that.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that. So, do you think that you're going to be able to develop? Because I know it's made in a lab, but it's still pretty expensive. I think a bottle's like at least the Neural RX is like $150 almost, $140, which is it's not that pricey if you're dealing with something neurological, because seeing functional practitioners and all of that is way more money than a couple bottles of Neural RX. But for the average person who's just trying to add a stack on or add a supplement, and it can be quite pricey if you have kids and whatever.
Yeah,
so do you think you're going to get that price down somehow, some way?
Yeah, that's my goal, is to, make it more available to more people. So yeah, over time, I've been working on different methods to make C60, because that's really the other components are reasonable. PQQ is kind of expensive. NMN is kind of expensive, but not even remotely close to C60. That's by far and away the most expensive component. And it's just because of the synthesis process. It's very difficult, and, it's very specialized. Like I had built a carbon arc, because that's one of the main methods that people use to make it, is you take two carbon graphite rods and you arc them together, and kind of when they explode and they get very hot, then, around 3 to 7% of the stuff that's left over is actually C60. And then you run it through a filtration column on an HPLC and you separate it out, and then you're left with the actual C60. But there are other ways to do it that are better. And, once I get it pegged down, I'll feel pretty hop skippy, because I'll be able to start making it something that's available for a lot more people.
Yeah, but that way sounds really fucking cool, though.
Sounds like it is.
That cool. Sounds really, really gnarly, dude.
It's actually, yeah, it's cool, and it's driven by at least the one I built. We drove it with two welding machines, so we had two very large arc welders, one on each side to power it, and put them together, and then it blows up, and it's 10,000 degrees, and it's super bright. And yeah, it is. It's like, for a science nerd, yeah, it was awesome. To build one of those things from scratch was great too. It was very fun.
That's amazing. Yeah, that was like, wow, that sounds actually fantastic. Just to be able to, as being, I'm not a science nerd, but I liked science when I was younger. It would be cool to just watch something like that. Sounds awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of, I still am kind of marveled at the fact that I get to do what I do, because I get to play with all kinds of cool stuff. And my lab is great because we've got a section for, chemistry and biochemistry, and then electronics, and then we have a metal fabrication shop down in one of the other bays. And so we can pretty much build anything. And I work in a lot of different fields. So I'm, part of the time I'm working on like concrete and biochar and, stuff like that. So it's very different than working with, V cells and doing stuff with, the microscopes in the other room. And it's all cordoned off in good ways, but it's so much fun, man. I mean, like you have, I'm definitely scratching my own itch and kind of, I wonder what that's like. How do I do that? How can I solve that puzzle? And, I'm pretty much trying to do things. When I opened the lab like a decade ago almost, I wrote down these 6 things on my board that I really wanted to solve. And so pretty much everything that I've been doing is kind of working towards that end. And it's funny because I wrote it down kind of like stream of consciousness, just like, these are the things that I want to do. And since then, everything has kind of been lining up. It's personally, my take on that is that we don't really push ourselves into the future. Much like nature, things, the wind doesn't, we think it's doing, like the wind is blowing. It's really not. It's actually being drawn past you, right? There's a low pressure center on one side of you, and it's being pulled past you. And similarly, I think, we have the conception, because we're, driven with an ego and in a frame of reference of a particular psyche, that we're doing all these things and pushing ourselves into the future, which I don't actually believe anymore. I think we have an inherent potential, in humanity as a whole is meant to move in a certain direction. And so we're actually being pulled in that direction. This is on the note of the meditation and, kind of working towards the expansion of your own consciousness and the stabilizing of it at different levels of awareness. One of the things that always used to really piss me off was when people would say, just you know yourself to be enlightened, understand it, it's all inherent, it's all there, and just you have to just let go. That used to drive me bananas because I would always be like, for the love of God, just tell me what to do. Give me the steps. I'll execute on the steps. Just make it programmatic. I'll work on it. I'll just work the steps. I'll go through this thing. Well, as it turns out, as much as it pains me to admit it, they were totally right? Like you're not pushing yourself forward. If anything, you are clinging desperately to the things that hold you down on the path up the mountain, right? It's not that you're climbing and trying to push yourself up this mountain. No, you're clinging to the rocks, and your own awareness and consciousness are intended to move you up. You just don't want to let go. The moment you let go, poof, everything just pops up. But you could not have gotten me to believe that. It's one of those things that it's experiential. You have to move through it. And you can say it as much as you want, but until you actually have the experience, it's an entirely different function.
No, I totally get it. If you'd have told me that 6 years ago, I'd have been like, "Fuck you! I don't want to hear that. Give me a system, give me a structure, tell me how to do it so I can work towards it. Not this sit in meditation, this foo-foo, let it come to you. You can attract it, or you can get more done by doing less and just thinking, like all these concepts. I would have never. I just wanted to know how to do something and then let me work towards it. And if I worked hard enough within that realm of that structure, then one day the new idea would pop into my head, or I would get a breakthrough of some sort. But it's so funny when you kind of get tapped in a little bit more to just like consciousness and things, that they are totally 100% right.
Damnedest thing. I hate to admit it. One of the guys that works with me, he's got a great heart, really great guy. And we were talking one day, and he was talking about kind of his own process, and wondering, he was kind of questioning himself, like, was he moving enough and doing enough? And he really does have a great heart, and he's driven just to help people, which is admirable. I mean, I wish there were a lot more of that in the world. And I said, look, man, don't stress about it. You're going to become exactly what you're intended to become. No acorn ever had to go to oak tree school. It's not like the inherent potential for what you're supposed to express and become is on board. It's already there. We just are moving through the motions of becoming what we really already are. And it just becomes more clear. It's like you kind of, I think your soul is fuzzy. It's kind of obfuscated a bit by a lens, and over the span of your life, you sort of polish the lens, and the image becomes more and more and more clear as you do that, until eventually you kind of go, oh, well, look at that. That's what I'm actually intended to become. And it's a process, but it doesn't have to be an arduous process. I mean, truly, the idea of the programmatic thing, basically, I would probably jump around and try all these different things, like, oh, let me try this style, and let me do this kind of meditation, and do this breath work, and try this. And the reality is, it wouldn't have mattered if I had just sat down. It was going to happen at the moment it was intended to happen, which, again, very frustrating, but also just the reality of it is, snow off a leaf. The moment it's supposed to happen, it does. And, but it's so different than the hard charging, like, I'm going to make this happen, that you approach it with. It's a bitch, because you don't, or at least for me, I couldn't wrap my brain around that at the time. And the funny part of that statement is it's very indicative of the problem. I was trying to wrap my brain around it. The reality was, I just ditched that entire construct. It had fuck all nothing to do with my brain whatsoever. It was entirely based around my consciousness, and actually just letting it kind of blossom into what it was meant to be. So
yeah, that's amazing. And kind of circling back around, that's why I love these products, because I think, and I know from experience, how much you basically can't get done when you're dysregulated. I was tapped in, I was doing mushroom ceremonies, I was trying combo, but at the end of the day, I was like just functioning at a very low level, a lot of fatigue, a lot of brain fog, wouldn't even have been able to have this conversation. And so I think that there's like, I try to have one foot in both worlds, which it seems like you kind of do as well, like super, meditations, a lot of consciousness, but also at the other end, it's like, there's a lot of environmental stressors, the food's not as good a quality as it used to be. So you kind of need to supplement so that you can be like optimized and be functioning optimally. And then from there, everything else will kind of fall into place, because if you have the energy to do everything and take care of your family and go to work or whatever it is that you have to do, then you will just be more productive, and then more free flowing ideas, just more creativity comes. Like the better I feel, I'm like, oh, I can't even believe that I can get all this done in one day, when I used to have to take a nap after just going to the store for 10 minutes because I felt, I don't know if it was the EMFs or just the people. I was so just affected by any little environmental stressor that I would just need a nap like every single day.
Yeah, I think I 100% agree. I think those things build up. I mean, if we lived in a perfect environment where we weren't beleaguered with EMFs all day and we didn't have, chemical toxins being, launched at us through everything we consume and everything we breathe. And one of the fundamental problems people aren't really acutely aware of, though they should be, is the respiration rate in the past century has shifted remarkably. We used to respire 6 to 8 times a minute. Now it's something like 14 to 16 times a minute. It's gone up so much because the available oxygen in the atmosphere has dropped. Our biology evolved with 21 parts or 21% oxygen is kind of the way we evolved biologically, and now we've got 19% oxygen in the atmosphere. So we're running at a 10% deficit. And how do we compensate? We breathe rapidly. It's kind of the same thing. Like if you need to move faster, your heart beats harder and beats faster because you're trying to compensate. It's kind of like respiratory tachycardia. We're having to respire more rapidly just all of the time because we need the oxygen, and so we're coming into it at a deficit. I think if, like as you said, if we were in a great environment, we were in nature and we didn't have all this stuff going on, and the world were clean, yeah, I probably wouldn't be working on making supplements and trying to rebalance people. I'd probably be chilling out by a stream somewhere, enjoying my day. Um, like look at all the pretty rocks on the beautiful stream. But the reality is the world is not that place. So you assess it for where it is and what it is, and I can contribute, I think, a bit. So that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, that's amazing. Before I switch topics, is there anything you think we missed out on C60? I know you could talk about it for days. Is there anything important that you want to add in on that C60 conversation?
No, I just think try it. Find an inexpensive variety. Try I'm kind of biased towards mine because I know that the way they're manufactured is really aces, and we do things a little differently, and the amounts we put in are higher. Everybody, I think, typically bops out at around 0.8 milligrams per milliliter, and I'm doing 1.2 mg per mil, with the exception of the one that's in the organic coconut oil, because it literally just won't hold that much with that lipid. But the other stuff is, like try the Evolve. You will feel the difference. If nothing else, you'll drop the inflammatory response in your body, and you'll feel better. Like for people that have arthritic conditions or things like that, and they just need the inflammatory response gone, drop the inflammation in your body, do something like that. And it's not so much whether it's my company or my old company or any of the other guys like Live Longer Labs, or some of the guys that I think are really on point, Purple Power. There's a lot of people that have good products. Just try it. But, it's a remarkable molecule. Again, I'm always looking for the thing that's gonna help people perform the best and become more effective. And I think if more people had an awareness of what exactly happens physiologically when you take it, it would be super popular. Not that I'm trying to be like the Linus Pauling of C60, but he kind of beat the drum on vitamin C and really got the message out there and consumed a ton of it. He'd do like 10 grams a day, and I do a huge amount of C60, but the benefits are great. And Linus lived to, I think at 90, something like that, or in his 90s rather. And, if all goes well, and I don't get back on my motorcycle and try and find patches of gravel at sunset, I'll probably live a reasonably long life in good health. And I granted I do a lot of other supplements and things, but I really do think that's kind of it's one of those supplements that you find that's kind of like, wow, this should be a cornerstone of people's kind of vitality program, their health span. Really look at what you can do to extend things. Just try it. You'll notice the difference. I mean, that's in part why I really got on the bandwagon, is after I did that first bit of testing, I thought, holy shit, this is remarkable. Like I need to do this, just for myself. If not just for myself, then certainly once I started doing it, I wanted all the people that I have my parents take it on the daily, my kids take it. Pretty much I try and I do seem like an evangelist, but it's only because I believe in the stuff. There are a lot of other things that I'm a pretty big evangelist for too, but this one I think is great. And I think it's really remarkable and makes a huge difference. So yeah, I think that's the final thought on C60 is just give it a whirl. Where it doesn't matter where you get the stuff from, just try it.
Yeah, you actually just sparked my interest. We forgot to kind of touch on the other the other ingredients in in the products. I know you have like serapeptase, you have NMN. Why'd you add these other compounds in there with the C60?
So it's to address the other side of the energetic cycle, right? So you block the systemic loss, but then if you put NMN and resveratrol in a ratio together, you can upregulate the performance, and you just get a much more robust energetic profile. So you start pumping out a lot more ATP, and you just have the capacity for much better output. The serapeptase, everybody has aggregates that build up in their body, whether it's sclerotic tissue or whether it's tau proteins or whatever in your brain. Everybody has buildup, and that proteolytic enzyme is great. It's for people who don't know, Serratia E15 or serapeptase or serratiopeptidase. It goes by a bunch of different names. It's a silkworm enzyme originally, and silkworms use it to break down their cocoon and emerge from chrysalis. And a lot of the proteins and plaques in the body are structurally similar. So when you take it, it actually breaks those down into components that you can process through. And so that's kind of a cornerstone I put in a lot of things because it's really very beneficial. It used to be a drug in Japan, then it was downgraded from a drug to a supplement because they found that they couldn't get levels high enough in the bloodstream to actually make a marked difference. But I think I've kind of surpassed that as an issue a while back, because when you put things in a sort of a nano buffer solution, it protects it against degradation in the GI tract. We tested things using a thing called Western blot analysis to look at denaturation of proteins. We tested it and found that we could keep the proteins from denaturing, in a very acidic environment, like to mimic stomach acid, and also up to 80 degrees C. So, like about 160 degrees. So very, very surprising how much we were able to keep the things from breaking down and the denaturation process from kicking in. And so it's really good if you can get a bunch of serapeptase in your system. I actually will tell people who have cardiac issues a lot of times, like, take this, but also supplement with additional serapeptase because it'll help kind of clean you out, almost like red yeast rice or something like that. And then some of the other things, the CoQ10, because I'm working on one of the components of the electron transport chain, and then PQQ, which is pyrroloquinoline quinone. And the PQQ, the idea there is, rather than just have the existing mitochondria pumping out a ton of extra energy based on the capacity, loading the mitochondria up with more C60 so that each individual one is putting out a huge amount of extra stuff. I thought, well, if you can add more mitochondria and make it a more diffuse, robust energy production system, it's better. Kind of the analogy is you can take a Ford Fiesta and put NOS on the motor and get 600 horsepower, but it's not going to go so well so long. You can get that kind of output, but if you take a V12 Mercedes biturbo, and you're going to get the same 600 horsepower when it's basically running at 2,000 RPMs and just kind of chilling out. And so my thought there was, well, if I can go in and I can actually trigger mitochondrial biogenesis and upregulate the amount of mitochondria, then I'll be able to distribute this load more evenly. And in the long term, that actually has a lot of benefits, because one of the new things I've been working with is taking urolithin A, which triggers mitophagy, and using that so that you end up with more mitochondria over time, but then you can go back and trigger mitophagy and actually cull through them and knock out the ones that aren't functioning as well. And so you again, you're just kind of rebuilding the body. This is in accord with, the stuff that I've been doing with V cells, because ultimately I want to make sure that, you don't want senescent cells floating around your body, right? Those are the zombie cells. And the problem with those is when normal cells start to dysregulate, they become senescent and they don't die. They just hang out. And that's, the zombie cells. But they perform a thing called paracrine signaling, which basically is just, it sets up a detrimental feedback loop and a cascade in the cells that it's in proximity to. So let's say you say 8% of the cells in your liver are senescent or something like that. It's going to set up a cascade and affect about 40% of your liver function. So it's that negative cascading and paracrine signaling effect that you're trying to move around. So I wanted to increase the number and then be able to cull through them so that the cells that are remaining have really super healthy mitochondria, and all the mitochondria within those cells are the most robust that they can be. So it's it's kind of it's a definitive process, but all of those different components are added in for a very specific purpose.
Yeah, I think you've kind of built on that over time, right? Because you used to have this C360 company that was mostly just like C60 with a few serums. Is everything now Wizard Sciences, or is it still two different companies?
There's still two different companies. I left C360. My son actually still runs the lab over there, but it's not my company anymore. I left and I wanted to go a slightly different direction. I wanted to do things that really pushed the bounds of what was biologically possible, not just continue to, sell things in the same capacity. The products are fine. I mean, they're very good. It was the initial run of formulas that I had worked on and come up with, and everything is good. I recommend people to that a lot, because they have some base level products that are, the C360 has, carbon 60 plus, which is a 1.0 mgs per mil strength C60 and olive oil, and it's very inexpensive and it's a good product. It's doesn't have the same degree of bioavailability. That was one of the things when I left and started Wizard. I really spent a lot of time looking at how to enhance the bioavailability of what I was doing, and that was one of the things that was kind of unfortunate. Is I realized it's not so much unfortunate. It's the progression. If you keep checking yourself and keep looking at what you're doing and trying to refine your own systems, you figure out, I should have done this. I could have done this. And so this is where I'm at now, is kind of the culmination of that. It's, when I find better processes, I switch, and I'm, pretty agnostic about what I'm doing, just as long as it's the kind of the state of the art and the best thing that I can do. So now every time I come up with something that makes it a little better or a little bit more refined, I do that, so we have the same formulas with the same ingredients, but sometimes I'll come up with a slightly different mechanism for delivery that enhances, bioavailability, and I'll shift, because the ultimate goal here is really to try and create the absolute best products I could. And so, and that's what I've been doing. So I'm probably biased on it, but I really do think that they're kind of aces at this point.
Yeah, for me, I have no idea. I was always had heard about C60 and never really tried it. And then Todd sent me over some of your products when we were scheduling the show, and I had the detox effects, and I'm like, oh, something's clearly working here. So I have no other comparison. I've only tried Wizard Sciences, so I don't know.
Yeah, well, feel free to give it a whirl at some point. You'll come back to it. Actually, one of the big telling things is, if you take our animal product, the Vortex or the canine formula, and you take that with some of the other things that are available for animals, and you put them side by side, I guarantee you I know which way the dog moves, because I've done it multiple times, and as have other people when we were doing the testing. There's no real placebo effect there. They just know physiologically what is good for them and what is better for them. And it's, I'm kind of a diehard, animal lover. So I would recommend that people use it with their animals too, because if you want to see the lifespan change in something where there's not a placebo effect, give it to an old dog. Oh my God, it's remarkable. Like you will see them in the matter of days go from acting like an old dog to acting like a puppy. It's fantastic. The same thing applies to people. If you're actually pushing yourself, you get a huge shift. Sometimes I'll hear people say, like on the Olympics here, I'm like, oh, I didn't notice anything. And I've never heard an athlete say that, because athletes immediately notice a difference. But it's kind of like my goal is to try and give people the best tools and resources that I can. But if you're going to sit on a couch and drink a bottle of something and expect that it's going to change your world, no. Unfortunately, that's not how this works. You actually have to put in the effort. I'll give you the wand, you have to cast the spell, right? Like, you have to, it's kind of an interactive thing. You've got to do something. That's why athletes are great for this stuff, is because they track their metrics, they know where their level of performance is, they're working on it constantly, so they see the benefit. And I kind of like to think of myself in terms of what I do in a lab as kind of like a mental athlete. I'm cognitively pushing myself all the time, trying to learn new things and do different things, so that I stay sort of at the cusp and the cutting edge of whatever field it is I'm working in at that particular moment. And it requires a lot of cognitive demand, and hence there's a lot of cognitive drain. So I do this stuff all the time. But it's, again, I've given myself the tools, but I still have to put in the work. I've had to learn things that seemingly are kind of funny. Like I did rapping and a bunch of other stuff, and then different languages, and because it was something I had never done. And I know that, you can do dual in-back training and things like that push your brain, but you're far better off if you do something, as I had said, that's a completely different neural pathway that you haven't used before. And that's where you really end up with something that's stronger and more robust. And so I'm kind of following my own advice there, and actually doing the work and trying to learn new things and push myself. So.
Yeah, that's great. I've actually heard you say that, if you're not dealing with like a neurological deficit like myself, but after you take the Neural RX or whatever for like a few weeks, you should start trying to learn something new, right?
Yeah, at about the 3-week mark is when your neurogenesis really kicks in, and you start getting a lot of new neurons at a faster pace. But again, your body, because they're so resource consumptive, your body goes through the synaptic pruning process and just whacks them. It doesn't want them to stick, because if something, and we talked about this, it accounts for 2.5 to 3% of your body mass, but consumes 20 to 25% of your available oxygen. Your body doesn't want that. It wants to regulate itself to be at the most optimal homeostatic balance for survival, not for optimum function, but for survival, right? So if you want to be a peak performer, you've got to tweak what you're doing a bit. That's why if you look at an athlete and they're super buff and they work out all the time, and then they stop for a month, they lose muscle mass, right? Why? Because you don't need that much muscle mass for survival. It's great if you're doing a specific task, but it's not what the body is designed to do. And so it regulates itself. In that case, or both of those cases, it down regulates itself so that your neural output drops, but also the demand on the system drops. Your muscular output drops, but also the demand for ATP drops throughout all of your musculature. The body is designed to survive. It's not designed to effectively thrive at any peak degree of capacity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's awesome. I kind of want to shift gears. We got just a little bit of time left, and talk about some of this like quantum biology. So I had Philip on the show. I don't know why I almost said Peter, but I had Philip on the show, and we talked about the quantum upgrade. But I kind of wanted to get your take on it, because you're pretty heavily involved in that as well. What have you seen with the quantum upgrade and the shifts in biology there?
It is remarkable, actually. It's one of those things that's so, it gets me excited, because quantum biology is really fun to me, because you can't look up the answers on Google, right? You can't find a book and say, oh, it's this. You actually have to think and design experiments to show things. And so one of the things we just did was this double-blinded study where we took cells for Leela at the university, and one professor cultured them and grew them and plated them and brought the plates out. And then I would take an image of one of the sets of well plates, like a 96 well plate filled with cells. And then I would send it to the Leela guys, and they would put it in the quantum upgrade program. And then we would do a 0 time point. And then we would do time points at intervals, like every 7-ish minutes. and look at the ATP output. And then before we did the final reading on everything, I would say, okay, it's this plate, and so right before the very last time point, so that I could identify for the professor like which one it was, and that was when the blinding ended, and then we would assess the data, and every time we were seeing an upwards of 20% jump in ATP in the cells, and the other cells that were, effectively the control group, they just had kind of a stochastic distribution where things moved kind of in a sort of normalish but slightly random function, but just what you would expect. Every single time the ATP output on the cells for the quantum upgrade jumped 20% or more. And that was it was funny because, I mean, I get what's going on to a degree as much as I think anybody can right now, because it's sort of a new field. But it's just remarkable when you say like, wow, okay, so something is exerting a force on these cells that's bumping up their cellular function over 20% from thousands of miles away, when only one person knows which cells are the affected cells. It tells you that, one, there has to be some sort of inherent intelligence that is isolating those things so it can know which grouping it is, or that perhaps the other approach is that we are part of a much larger thing that inherent intelligence is a fraction of, and that allows for it to know which set of cells are which. But it's just it kind of makes me a little giddy because it's so bizarre with what classically we're taught. But I know that the waveforms are all interactive, right? And so things are definitively non-local and they're happening at a distance. And when I talk about waveform dynamics, actually, Philip asked me a couple of years ago to do a demonstration at the biohacking conference in Florida. And I think it was 2021. And he said, do you think you can do something to show people that there's quantum behavior going on, that this isn't all just woo woo kind of stuff? And I said, yeah, I've got an idea. So actually with Todd, I called Todd because he has this horrible shellfish allergy, and said, hey man, I have this idea for a demonstration at the biohacking conference. Would you be down for doing something? He said, yeah, sure. And I said, okay, so you have a crab allergy, right? And he said, yeah, shellfish, and it's really bad. I said, okay, can you get some crab meat? And he said, yeah, do you want me to like put the crab juice in my eyes or something? Hats off to Todd for being, super trusting. But I was like, no, man, I really, no, I definitely don't want to put crab juice in your eyes. I said, what I want to do is like a derma roller. So at the conference, we took a can of crab juice or a can of crab meat, and I opened it up and I derma rolled his arm, and then I put the crab juice from the can on it, and instantly had a bad histamine reaction, right? His arm blew up, turned to welts. And this is, you can find it on YouTube, because a lot of people took video of it. But it, it was mimicking a dermal stamp test from an allergist, right? Where you would do the needle pricks and then see what reacted. Well, in this case, it was just one long swath from a derma roller, and then the crab juice was put in. And so the whole thing blew up and got, big welts and all that. But then I put the crab meat inside a quantum block, which is kind of similar to the quantum upgrade program, but the block is actually just these static pieces of anodized aluminum that have been modulated at a quantum level. And so I put it in there, and I just started talking about waveform dynamics. And one of the things that's interesting when you start looking at quantum physics is, we all think that we're physical, and we are in aggregate, but really when you start breaking it down bit by bit to look at what's really going on, you never actually touch everything. It's just, when I do this, it's electron cloud repulsion, right? So the electron clouds in that cup are pushing on the electron clouds in my finger, and the percussive nature of that is expressed by the force of those electron cloud interactions. So it's really just this repulsive force in differing degrees. And we are a collection of vibrating things. So a histamine reaction, as most people understand it, is this biochemical process. And it is, but that's actually kind of a tertiary thing that's very downstream from what's really going on. What's really happening is everything functions either constructively or destructively as waveforms. That's why some things are provide an allergic reaction for you, and some things provide a beneficial reaction. If you have an allergic reaction, you're having a destructive interference pattern within a waveform. So the waveform that you consider to be yourself doesn't jive with whatever that particular compound is. So with Todd, after I put the crab meat in the block, I took it out and derma rolled his other arm, and then put the same crab juice in on the derma rolling on the other arm, and there was no reaction. And it's because the block changed the quantum functioning of the thing so that it made it more conducive to his biology. So there was no longer a harsh destructive interference. There was more of a constructive interference. And so the waveforms weren't at opposition. And so it's almost like you're sanding down something at 2 levels before subatomic. And so the aggregate effect of that is things just function more effectively.
That's super bizarre. Do you think the quantum upgrade helps with with those histamine and food allergy? Because I've had it on since you guys put it out. And I've actually had gluten a couple times recently that would normally it wasn't that bad of a reaction, but super bloated, just wouldn't really feel that well if I eat gluten. I've had it a couple times recently, and I haven't really had a reaction at all. It's not a staple of my diet or anything, but it's kind of bizarre that I've had it and I didn't have any reaction. I didn't know if it was just from healing a little bit or the quantum upgrade. I wasn't really sure.
Well, okay, so 2 things. One, we always say, don't do this at home, kind of a thing. It's just a standard disclaimer. So because we live in a painfully litigious society and everybody sues everybody for everything. Luckily, you got my pronouns right today, so I don't have to sue you. Basically, there was a study that was just completed in Europe, and the data showed that after 3 minutes on a block, there was about a 75% reduction in response, like histamine responses and allergic responses to different foods. And after 4 minutes, there was about an 85% to 90% reduction, which is kind of remarkable. And so is there a difference? Yeah, definitively there's a difference. So the quantum upgrade program, we haven't tested that portion of it yet. We did this with the block, but I would be inclined to say, since they're coming from the same sort of a quantum manipulation, yeah, I would say that there's going to be a definitive result. And obviously you're seeing it. It's just one of those things, as a scientist, you have to be kind of ambivalent about where it is and agnostic about what you're doing, and you're just like, okay, whatever, I'm not gonna say it's this or it's this, but I will tell you what the data says, right? And that's why I can say definitively, like, we were showing 20% jumps in ATP output. Absolutely, we did it. We ran the experiment in quadruplicate. It's just a thing. I'm not going to say that it's good, it's bad, it's otherwise, but I will definitively say that was the data. And with the being able to take away someone's histamine reaction instantly or within a few minutes, that is not, if you run down things the way that we think things ran, that's not something that happens. You don't go from having an allergic reaction to not having an allergic reaction to the same compound from the same can in 3 minutes, right? There's something obviously that's different. And so I kind of feel like, as a scientist, you have to pull the thread, right? You look at that and go, okay, I don't understand it, but obviously there's some effect. I'd better pull that thread and see what's going on. Which, again, that's why I'm kind of jazzed by all this stuff, is I know that there are effects because we've proven that there are effects. Now it's just a matter of running it down a little bit more and seeing where it goes. And it also makes me wonder how much of other things that we perceive where we have to make special cases and special exceptions for, how much of that is just us misattributing or things to specific interactions, where they're really shifts at a level that's so subtle that we don't normally see them or perceive them, that are actually kind of cropping up to change things. Actually, the thing that always comes to mind here is there was an old Far Side cartoon that I love that I think is very indicative of how science really works. And it was these 2 sharks swimming, and then one looks over at the other one as all these people are running up on the beach and says, "Dude, your dorsal fin is sticking up. I wonder how long that's been screwing things up for us." And I think a lot of times that's really kind of how we are, is we're like, well, look at that. well, I didn't know that was there. I mean, it's been there the entire time. We just haven't noticed it. I always say that, a lot of this stuff is kind of like if 500 years ago you had said, listen, when you get ill, it's because of these little bitty bugs and they're moving in your body and they're replicating and growing in number, and that was all pre-microscope, right? So pre von Leeuwenhoek, you didn't have the capacity to see when something was happening and a bacteria was growing. Afterwards, you could see that things were actually transpiring. But before we had the nomenclature to say it is a this or it is a that, and before we had the equipment to actually test for it and definitively mark it out, it was, it kind of seemed like magic, like, oh, you're sick because of the humors. I mean, we were doing the best we could, but we just didn't have the terminology. And the quantum biology, it's the same thing right now. We're doing the best we can, but we're still shooting around it. Like I can run a spectral analysis on something with a gas chromatograph, and it will tell me you have this molecule, right? And that's effectively like saying you have a box, and the box is this size, right? I've got a specific configuration in space that is this thing. But, well, let's suppose there's something in the box, right? Well, that's kind of where we are with quantum biology is we don't yet have the data to really discern what's happening inside the box. We know there's a box, and that's where the science stops. But one of the analogies I'll use is I'll say, okay, imagine you have a suitcase and it's filled with gyroscopes and they're just randomly sitting there and they're not spinning, and you're running down and you take a 90-degree turn while you're running. You're fine. You can make the turn, no big deal. Well, imagine you're running down and all of the gyroscopes are on and spinning in the same direction, and you take that turn. You're going to get pulled off of your feet by the resistance, and it's the same thing. We know that there's something happening, but we don't yet know what. And that's, I mean, I kind of feel like that's what, as a scientist, it's sort of incumbent upon you to try and figure that out, because that's what will push the next generation forward. And a lot of the assessments, I make or my colleagues may make, we could be completely wrong, and that's okay. Hopefully we'll do the test, we'll get the data, we'll suss something out, we'll figure out what's going on, and we'll make our best educated guess, test out a hypothesis, see if it works, and then we'll build on that. But again, maybe somebody comes out with something a few decades from now and realizes it's like, oh, well, it was actually this. Yeah, so be it. Is part of one of the cogs in the wheel. We're just trying to move things forward a little bit so that those guys can get to the point where they can figure it out.
Yeah, it's super cool. I kind of like the fact that we don't know exactly what's working, but it's working. It's like this mysterious type of thing. But I know for a fact that when I bumped it up too high when I first got it, I was like, I got to turn this down. My wife was like, turn the shit down, like, because I had it bumped up a little bit.
Well, I was at a conference and there was a fellow named Larry Pham there, and he caught me when I was coming into the conference one morning, and he said, Ian, he was tracking, he had I think an Apple Watch that he was using, and maybe it was a Fitbit, but he was tracking his pulse at the time. And he said, I don't know what's going on. When I walk across to the other side of the room, my heart rate's going up 20 beats a minute. And he showed me, and it was. And I said, well, Larry, that's because you're walking in proximity to this Gen 8 block that we have. And I said, it's overloading your nervous system a little bit. It's too much, quantum energy coming out. And that sounds kind of, to a lot of people, it'll sound a little woo woo, but we did the experiment there and I did it with him real time to show him what was happening. And, the closer he would get to the block, the more things would accelerate. And then he'd walk back on the other side of the room and it would drop again. And so it's a proximity effect. But it's also your nervous system has to be adapted to it. It's kind of like lifting weights. Even though working out is super beneficial, you don't want to go into the gym and put, 4 45-pound plates on each side of a bell and, or a bar rather, and start doing incline presses. You'll kill yourself, right? Like that's not how that works. You've got to work up to it. And in this, the same way, you ratchet the number down, and the numbers are kind of, they're for sake of ease, they're built along the Hawkins scale, in terms of the output of the levels of consciousness. And I would recommend that anybody who hasn't read that book, not actually read the book, but get the audiobook on Audible. Listen to, Power versus Force by David Hawkins. It's brilliant. It's probably literally the single most impactful thing I've ever read and listened to in my entire life. But the Leela stuff is all broken down on the quantum upgrade program so that you can go in and you can adjust it based on the level of consciousness, which is a good indicator. And just because you pump something up to 600 doesn't mean your consciousness is moving to that point. It just means that that's kind of the environment that you're in, because there are lots of things. Like if you go into a church, or like an old cathedral, that's gonna pump the environment around you up pretty substantially to above the 600 threshold. And for those of you who haven't read the book, those numbers they'll seem a little bit arbitrary, but again, I just recommend everybody kind of familiarize themselves with it, because it's a very brilliant way to assess different states of awareness and consciousness. But yeah, you have to find what's appropriate for your own physiology. And then after you do it for a little while, and I'm sure you did this, after you did it for a little while, you could handle what you couldn't handle before. And then you dial it up again. So.
Yeah. Now I'm at 900. 1,000 still seems a little too strong for me. I've tried to, because I can actually, because every people who don't have it don't know, but every so often they unlock like another 100. You can go up a little bit, and 1,000 still kind of makes me a little tired, a little fatigued, and so I'm like, all right, I'll just stick with the 900 until for a little bit longer. But I've had to gradually bump that up over. I've had it since you guys dropped it. That's got to be like 4 or 5 months now. So like every month and a half or whatever, I go up 100, and then it seems pretty normal, and I get like a kind of another boost of energy. But if I do too much, then I get tired. So it's kind of funny. What are you at now? 1,500?
Yeah, not to be disclosed. Actually, I try and probably nothing that cool. So
yeah, I didn't know. I thought Philip said something about people are using 1,400 or something, and they're just, you also have to make sure, obviously, people have safely used that level for a period of time before you allow the general public to do that. But I was interested.
Well, I think it it depends. I love the program, use the program. I have it on my office, but it's a really good thing. But the effects on me are perhaps a little different than on your average bear lately. So and when we're offline, I'll maybe do a demonstration of that thing that I was actually at a dinner with the Leela guys and a bunch of people at a conference about a week ago, and beyond a certain level of consciousness, and I'm probably a little brazen and talk about it a little bit much, but it's kind of funny to me because it's just a scientific curiosity. Beyond a certain threshold, you're able to do things that are not standard. You have capacities that just aren't normal, but everybody can work up to it. And so for me, the effects of the upgrade are a little different, I would say, than on most people. But it's great. I mean, I love it to have it around the lab, because it's really nice for the staff, and luckily everybody that works here, I think, has a really good attitude anyway. But I think it's conducive to a really loving environment. So that's probably my favorite part of that.
Yeah, I think it helps. And then I have the inner peace on my house as well. And I felt like I've slept a lot better. And it just like, the whole house has just been real calm and chill. Me and my wife don't really argue that much anyways. We're both pretty good at communication if something's really off or feeling off, or one of us needs attention or whatever. But it seems like there's just an added level of like less anxiety and less kind of like frustration with the inner peace stacked on top of the quantum upgrade as well.
Yeah, I still carry. I think I have the gratitude card in my wallet. Because that's actually something that I think everybody should really focus on, is like having having a lot of gratitude is pretty cool. And
right,
the gratitude card. I love these things. I generally don't have them, even though that I'm the scientific advisor for the company. I generally don't have my heal capsule or my cards, because I keep giving them away to people. Because, well, I mean, that's kind of the thing, right? Is ultimately you hope that that's sort of intrinsic inside yourself. Is you don't have to have it extrinsically applied. You sort of become the beacon for it, and you're kind of pushing out love and harmony and good stuff all the time anyway. And so usually when I have these things, I'll probably have that gratitude card for another week or so. And I'm sure at some point I'll be like, hey, here you go. Enjoy.
Yeah, that's amazing. Cool, man. Well, I think we rocked it out. I think we covered a lot of ground here today. Had a lot of just cool regular conversation, but also got a few questions in as well. Why don't you tell everybody what's 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 next? What are you working on, and tell everyone where they can find you as well.
Well, I'm actually, let's see, I'm working on some kind of interesting physics stuff around propulsion systems that are really cool, and I'm actually gonna write some papers and put them out just about one of the drive systems that I tested out here that other people have been working on. I think they just unfortunately missed some of the principles. So I'm going to push that out, and then I've got a couple of other environmental things that I'm doing, desalination specifically, because one of my goals was to try and help get clean water for people. So I worked out a system for desalination, and I'm going to try and get some traction with that. And then I'm going to keep doing all of the wizard stuff, and coming up with more serums and formulas to help people. And then I'm working with another company that's doing red light and infrared therapies, and a company doing cosmetic stuff, and then another company doing nootropics. And so kind of keeping myself really super busy, but all things that I think will actually kind of beneficially move the needle in a lot of ways. And anybody who's curious, you can find me on Instagram at Wizard Sciences, or you can hit me up at Ian Mitchell 1 is my personal thing. And a lot of people ping me just to ask questions, and I still, it's getting more and more difficult to keep up. I still respond to everybody, but it's taking longer and longer. And honestly, at this point, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to do that, because just the number of people that are pinging me with direct messages, to try and respond to things, it takes a fair amount of time just to respond. So, but for now, I'm able to do it, and I always feel like if you have the capacity to answer somebody's questions, it's sort of incumbent upon you to do that, because what good is the knowledge if you don't share it? So while I'm accessible and I can still do it, I still try and help everybody as much as I can. But I think we're maybe moving to a format where I might start doing, kind of a weekly thing where I'll have, like a weekly show where I'll just kind of an AMA, where if people have concerns or questions about something, they can just reach out to me. And for an hour or so, I'll be available, and just, they can send in questions, and then I'll just try and field as many of them as I can. And the idea being it'd be, an open access forum so that people could get access to the data and find the answers. Other than that, I think I'm just going to continue working on the expansion of my own awareness and trying to do good things. I mean, just kindness is pretty cheap. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort to change the world. Just go out and be nice to people, and that's a pretty big a big one. So I think that's, I have my safety third t-shirt on, which is kind of the motto at the lab, and everybody asks, like, what's first? And well, kindness and innovation. So kindness is first, innovation is second, safety is third. So it's sort of the shirt's actually an homage to me blowing up the lab when I was trying to figure out one of the products that I made. But that's okay. You want to change the world, get a lot of smart people in a room who really aren't that concerned with that sort of stuff, and who really want to make a difference, and you'll end up helping things. But it may not be within the normal constraints that everybody else is playing in. So
awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time out today. I think that you're super, super intelligent. Your heart's in the right place. You're pushing the envelope. So I'll continue to push your products. And,
thanks, man.
Maybe as new products and new things come out, maybe we can have a few more chats on the show.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. I genuinely appreciate that. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Enjoy your day.